Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Eric Cartman is not just a funny fat kid who says offensive things on a cartoon. He is a textbook case of childhood antisocial development produced almost entirely by environmental failure. A psychologist evaluating Cartman would immediately identify conduct disorder with callous unemotional traits, narcissistic compensation masking profound insecurity, attachment disruption from inconsistent caregiving, and the devastating long-term effects of permissive parenting combined with complete father absence. Every single behavior we laugh at across 27 seasons of South Park traces back to identifiable psychological causes. The manipulation, the bigotry, the elaborate schemes, the cruelty, all of it follows recognizable clinical patterns that psychologists have studied for decades. Understanding Cartman through actual psychological frameworks reveals something uncomfortable. He is not a monster who appeared out of nowhere. He is the predictable product of what happens when every system meant to protect a child fails completely. His mother failed. His absent father failed. His school failed. His community failed. And the result is one of the most psychologically damaged children in television history, hiding in plain sight behind comedy and crude humor. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. What's actually wrong with Eric Cartman? If you brought Eric Theodore Cartman into a therapist's office and somehow got him to sit still long enough for a proper psychological evaluation, the results would be disturbing. Not because the clinician would struggle to find something wrong, but because they would find so many things wrong simultaneously that the diagnostic picture would be one of the most complex they had ever encountered in a child his age. Within the first few minutes of the session, the psychologist would notice several things. Cartman would likely attempt to take control of the conversation immediately. He would test boundaries, probing for weaknesses in the examiner's authority. He would alternate between superficial charm when he wanted something and open hostility when he felt challenged. He would lie casually and convincingly about basic facts, and if the psychologist mentioned anything about his weight, the session would likely devolve into a screaming match before it even properly began. Now, here is something important to understand before we go any further. Psychologists do not formally diagnose personality disorders in children. The brain is still developing. Personality is still forming. A 9-year-old cannot receive a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, because the clinical community recognizes that children are still changing, still growing, still capable of developing in directions that might look very different from their current behavior. This is a crucial distinction. However, what psychologists can diagnose in children are the precursor conditions that often develop into those adult personality disorders if left untreated. And the primary precursor condition that a psychologist would identify in Eric Cartman is conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is defined in the DSM-5 as a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms are violated. The diagnostic criteria fall into 4 categories: aggression toward people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious violations of rules. Cartman does not just meet these criteria, he exceeds them in ways that would alarm any clinician. The aggression category alone provides overwhelming evidence. In the episode Tist, the opening scene reveals that Cartman has handcuffed a classmate named Billy Turner's ankle to a flagpole and given him a hacksaw. He then told Billy that he had poisoned his lunch milk and that the only way to reach the antidote in time would be to saw through his own leg. This is not a schoolyard prank. This is a scenario lifted directly from the Saw horror franchise, recreated by a 9-year-old against a classmate whose only offense was apparently making fun of Cartman's weight. The level of premeditation, the psychological cruelty, the complete absence of concern for the victim's well-being, all of it points to severe conduct problems that go far beyond typical childhood misbehavior. But the Saw incident is mild compared to what happens in Scott Tenorman Must Die. In this episode, Cartman is humiliated by an older boy named Scott Tenorman, who tricks him into buying pubic hair for $16.12. After multiple failed attempts to get revenge, each of which ends with further humiliation, Cartman devises a plan so elaborate and so horrifying that it represents a genuine watershed moment in the show's history. He orchestrates a scenario in which Scott's parents are shot and killed by a local farmer. He then steals their bodies, dismembers them with a hacksaw overnight, cooks them into chili, and feeds them to Scott at a public chili cook-off. When Scott discovers what he has just eaten, when he pulls his own mother's finger from the bowl and begins sobbing uncontrollably, Cartman's response is to climb onto the table and sing a mocking song. Then he licks the tears directly from Scott's face, savoring what he calls the tears of unfathomable sadness. A psychologist would read that case file and immediately flag it as evidence of the most severe possible conduct disorder, with the callous unemotional traits specifier. The callous unemotional specifier is a relatively recent addition to the diagnostic framework, added because researchers recognize that some children with conduct disorder show a particular pattern that is especially concerning. These children demonstrate a persistent lack of remorse or guilt. They show callous lack of empathy. They are unconcerned about their performance in important activities. And they display shallow or deficient affect, meaning their emotional expressions seem fake or are used exclusively to manipulate others. Cartman checks every single one of these boxes. He shows no remorse for feeding Scott his parents. He shows no empathy for Scott's suffering. He is unconcerned about the moral implications of his actions, and the only emotion he displays is sadistic pleasure in his victim's pain. Beyond conduct disorder, the psychologist would also note significant narcissistic traits. Cartman has a massively inflated sense of his own importance. He demands that others respect his authority, a phrase he repeats so often it has become one of the show's most iconic catchphrases. He believes he is destined for greatness and wealth, frequently declaring that his dream is to have $10 million. He cannot tolerate criticism, especially about his weight, responding to even mild teasing with explosive rage or elaborate revenge schemes. He exploits others without guilt. He requires constant admiration and attention. He lacks the ability to recognize or care about other people's feelings unless those feelings can be used to his advantage. The narcissistic traits interact with the conduct disorder in dangerous ways. His grandiose self-image provides the motivation for his schemes. He believes he deserves whatever he wants. The conduct disorder provides the behavioral toolkit. He is willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And the callous, unemotional traits remove the moral brakes that would stop a typical child from crossing certain lines. Together, these three elements create a psychological profile that is genuinely frightening in a child this young. The psychologist would also note antisocial traits that go beyond typical conduct disorder. Cartman lies constantly and effectively. He manipulates adults and children alike with practiced ease. He shows a pattern of impulsive behavior that alternates with periods of highly calculated, strategic action. He is irritable and aggressive, quick to anger, and slow to forgive. He has repeatedly demonstrated willingness to cause serious harm to others for trivial reasons. And perhaps most concerning, he shows evidence of taking pleasure in the suffering of others, which moves beyond simple antisocial behavior into territory that suggests sadistic personality features. However, a careful psychologist would also note what Cartman does not show. He does not have psychotic symptoms. His perception of reality is generally accurate, even if his moral reasoning is severely distorted. He is not intellectually disabled. In fact, his intelligence is well above average when applied to strategic thinking and manipulation. His schemes require sophisticated understanding of human psychology, multi-step planning, and the ability to predict how multiple people will behave in response to carefully orchestrated situations. The Scott Tenorman scheme alone demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that would be impressive in an adult, let alone a child. He also does not show signs of mood disorders in the traditional sense. He is not depressed. He does not cycle through manic and depressive episodes. His emotional state is relatively consistent. He is self-interested, easily angered when his ego is threatened, and generally satisfied with himself and his behavior. This emotional stability, paradoxically, is part of what makes his condition so concerning. He is not acting out because he is suffering internally. He is acting out because his personality has developed around patterns of exploitation and dominance, and those patterns work for him within his environment. He gets what he wants. He avoids consequences. Life, from Cartman's perspective, is going pretty well. The formal evaluation would likely include several diagnostic considerations. Conduct disorder, childhood onset type, with the callous unemotional trait specifier would be the primary diagnosis. Narcissistic personality traits would be noted, with the caveat that formal personality disorder diagnosis is deferred until adulthood. Antisocial personality traits would similarly be noted as a concern for future development. The report would emphasize that without intensive, sustained intervention, the prognosis for improvement is poor, and the likelihood of progression to adult antisocial personality disorder is high. There is one more aspect of Cartman's diagnostic profile that deserves extended attention before we move on, and it is the paradox that sits at the center of his entire psychology. Eric Cartman has extraordinary emotional intelligence directed outward and virtually no emotional intelligence directed inward. He can read other people with a precision that borders on clinical. He can identify their vulnerabilities, predict their behavior, anticipate their emotional reactions, and tailor his approach to each individual target with remarkable accuracy. But when it comes to understanding his own emotional landscape, his own motivations, his own needs and fears, he is almost completely blind. This paradox would fascinate a psychologist because it contradicts the popular assumption that emotional intelligence is a single, unified capacity. People tend to think that if you are good at reading others, you must also be good at reading yourself. The research suggests otherwise. The ability to perceive and manipulate other people's emotions can develop independently of the ability to perceive and manage your own. In fact, in some clinical populations, particularly those with antisocial and narcissistic traits, the two capacities can develop in opposite directions. The person becomes increasingly skilled at reading others precisely because they cannot rely on their own emotional compass for guidance. They learn to navigate the world by reading external cues rather than internal ones. The same way a person who has lost their sense of direction might become exceptionally skilled at reading maps. The skill develops as compensation for the deficit. Watch how Cartman operates in the episode The Death of Eric Cartman. When Butters is the only person still interacting with him and Cartman believes he has died and become a ghost, Cartman manipulates Butters into helping him make amends for his sins so he can cross over to the other side. During this process, Cartman demonstrates an accurate and detailed understanding of how he has wronged each person he attempts to apologize to. He knows exactly what he did to each person, why it hurt them, and what they would need to hear in order to forgive him. He can articulate the impact of his behavior on others with startling precision, but he does not feel any of it. The apologies are strategic, not sincere. He is performing remorse because he believes performing remorse is the action required to achieve his goal, which is to stop being a ghost. He understands the concept of remorse the way a mechanic understands a car engine. He knows how all the parts work. He knows what each piece does. He can take it apart and put it back together, but he cannot drive it. He cannot experience what it actually feels like to be sorry. This split between cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what others feel, and affective empathy, the ability to share those feelings, is one of the defining features of psychopathic personality traits. Research by psychologist James Blair and others has shown that individuals with psychopathic traits often score normally or even above average on tests of cognitive empathy. They can identify emotions in facial expressions. They can predict how people will react in emotional situations. They can describe the internal experiences of others with accuracy. What they lack is the affective component, the visceral, felt response that makes another person's pain register as something that matters to you personally. Cartman's cognitive empathy is what makes him such an effective manipulator. He does not stumble into successful manipulation by accident. He succeeds because he accurately models the psychological states of his targets and constructs strategies that exploit those states with precision. His manipulation of Butters works because he correctly identifies that Butters craves friendship and validation. His manipulation of Kyle works because he correctly identifies that Kyle is driven by moral outrage and cannot resist engaging with injustice. His manipulation of his mother works because he correctly identifies that she cannot tolerate his distress and will do anything to make it stop. Each manipulation is tailored, considered, and based on accurate psychological assessment of the target. But turn that assessment inward. Ask Cartman why he does what he does. Ask him what he is actually feeling underneath the bravado and the scheming, and you get nothing. Or rather, you get the narcissistic facade, which is not self-knowledge but self-performance. He will tell you he is awesome. He will tell you he is destined for greatness. He will tell you that everyone else is the problem. What he will not tell you, because he genuinely does not know, is that he is lonely, frightened, empty, and desperately compensating for an absence at the center of his identity that he cannot name and cannot fill. The destruction of property criteria for conduct disorder also deserves closer examination, because Cartman's relationship with property destruction reveals something about his psychology that simple aggression does not. In the episode Cartman Land, when Cartman eventually loses the amusement park due to financial mismanagement and lawsuits, his response is not just anger. It is something closer to existential despair, but directed outward. He does not grieve the loss. He rages against the universe for taking something that was his. His sense of ownership, his belief that things he possesses are extensions of himself, means that losing property feels like losing part of his identity. And when that loss occurs, the response is destructive, both toward the lost object and toward anyone he perceives as responsible. This pattern recurs throughout the series. Cartman does not just want things, he incorporates them into his self-concept. His toys, his food, his schemes, his perceived possessions are not separate from him. They are him. This is characteristic of what psychologists call narcissistic extension, the tendency to experience external objects, people, and achievements as part of the self, rather than as separate entities that the self interacts with. When Cartman says something is his, he means it in a way that goes far deeper than ordinary possessiveness. He means that the thing is an actual component of his identity, and threatening it is equivalent to threatening him personally. The deceitfulness criteria barely needs elaboration because Cartman's lying is so pervasive that it practically constitutes a second language. But the nature of his lying is worth examining. There are different types of liars. Some people lie defensively to avoid punishment or embarrassment. Some lie instrumentally to achieve specific goals. Some lie compulsively, unable to stop even when the truth would serve them better. And some lie recreationally, enjoying the act of deception itself, taking pleasure in the knowledge that they are successfully controlling another person's perception of reality. Cartman engages in all four types, but it is the recreational lying that would most concern a clinician. There are moments throughout the series where Cartman lies when there is no practical benefit to lying. He lies about trivial things. He lies when the truth would be perfectly acceptable. He embellishes stories that do not need embellishment. He fabricates details that serve no strategic purpose. This pattern suggests that deception has become autonomous, running on its own logic independent of any particular goal. Lying is not just something Cartman does. It is something Cartman is. The serious violations of rules category completes the diagnostic picture, and here Cartman's record is extensive. He has truanted from school. He has run away from home. He has engaged in activities that are illegal for adults, let alone children. He has participated in schemes that involve fraud, identity theft, and what would constitute conspiracy in any adult legal proceeding. The rule violations are not the rebellious boundary testing of a normal child who is learning where the limits are. They are the systematic disregard of a child who has learned through years of experience that rules are obstacles to be circumvented rather than guidelines to be followed. He does not break rules because he is impulsive and forgets them in the moment. He breaks rules because he has concluded, based on accurate observation of his environment, that rules carry no meaningful consequences for him, and therefore represent nothing more than inefficiencies in his pursuit of whatever he wants. But here is what makes Cartman's case truly interesting from a clinical perspective. These diagnostic labels describe his symptoms, but they do not explain them. They tell us what is wrong with Eric Cartman, but not why he became this way. Conduct disorder and narcissistic traits and callous unemotional features do not appear out of nowhere. They develop in response to something, usually something in the child's environment that shaped how they see themselves and the world around them. And to understand Eric Cartman, we cannot stop at the diagnosis. We need to look deeper at the environment that created these patterns in the first place. Because somewhere in Cartman's life lies a set of failures so complete that they warped his entire personality development, turning what might have been a normal child into the manipulative, cruel, and deeply damaged person we see across 27 seasons of television. That environment is where the real story begins. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The origin of Cartman's pathology is not a single traumatic event. It is not a bomb through a portal or a murdered spouse. It is something quieter, more insidious, and in many ways more devastating because it happens slowly, invisibly, every single day of his life. The origin is his mother. Leon Cartman is one of the most fascinating characters in South Park precisely because she looks like the opposite of what she actually is. On the surface, she appears to be a loving, devoted, sweet-natured mother who dotes on her son endlessly. She speaks in a soft, kind voice. She calls Cartman sweetie and poopsikins. She cooks for him, buys him whatever he wants, and rarely raises her voice. To a casual observer, Leon looks like the perfect mother. She looks like she loves her son unconditionally and gives him everything he could ever want. A psychologist would see something very different. They would see a textbook case of permissive, indulgent parenting taken to a pathological extreme, combined with emotional neglect disguised as devotion, and a set of personal issues so severe that they fundamentally compromise her ability to function as a parent. To understand why this matters, we need to talk about Diana Baumrind's parenting styles framework, which is one of the foundational models in developmental psychology. Baumrind identified 4 primary parenting styles based on 2 dimensions. Responsiveness, meaning how warm and supportive the parent is, and demandingness, meaning how much structure, discipline, and expectations the parent provides. Authoritative parents are high on both dimensions. They are warm and supportive while also setting clear boundaries and expectations. Research consistently shows this produces the best outcomes for children. Authoritarian parents are high on demandingness but low on responsiveness. They enforce strict rules but provide little warmth. Uninvolved parents are low on both dimensions. They neither nurture nor discipline. And permissive parents are high on responsiveness but low on demandingness. They are warm and loving but provide virtually no structure, discipline, or consequences. Leanne Cartman is the purest example of permissive parenting ever depicted in fiction. She gives Cartman everything he wants. She never says no. She never enforces consequences. She never sets boundaries. When Cartman screams at her, she capitulates. When he demands specific foods, she makes them. When he throws tantrums, she gives in. When school officials contact her about his behavior, she cries and admits she cannot control him, but she never actually attempts to change the dynamic. Her love for Cartman is real, but it is expressed entirely through giving him whatever he wants in the moment rather than providing what he actually needs for healthy development. And what children need for healthy development, above almost everything else, is boundaries. This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in developmental psychology, but it is one of the most robust. Children do not thrive when they get everything they want. They thrive when they encounter consistent limits that teach them the world does not revolve around them. Boundaries teach frustration tolerance, which is the ability to cope with not getting what you want immediately. They teach impulse control, which is the ability to delay gratification and consider consequences before acting. They teach empathy, because understanding that other people have needs and rights requires first learning that your own desires are not the only ones that matter. And they teach emotional regulation, because learning to manage disappointment and anger requires actually experiencing those emotions in safe, structured contexts where a parent helps you process them. Cartman has never experienced any of this. He has never been told no and had it stick. He has never experienced consistent consequences for bad behavior. He has never had to develop frustration tolerance because every frustration is immediately removed by his mother. He has never had to develop empathy because his environment has taught him over thousands of interactions that his needs are the only ones that matter. The result is exactly what the research predicts. Children raised with permissive parenting show higher rates of behavioral problems, lower self-regulation, increased aggression, and greater difficulty with peer relationships. Cartman is the extreme end of every single one of these predicted outcomes. But Leanne's parenting goes beyond simple permissiveness. There is a darker dimension that becomes clear when you examine her behavior more carefully. Leanne does not just spoil Cartman, she uses Cartman. Specifically, she treats him as an emotional companion rather than a child she is responsible for raising. This is a recognized psychological phenomenon called parentification, and it is a form of emotional abuse. In the episode Dust, which is essentially a 22-minute case study in Cartman's family dynamics, this pattern becomes explicitly visible. When Caesar Millen, the dog whisperer, successfully modifies Cartman's behavior using dominance-based techniques typically used on aggressive dogs, something remarkable happens. Cartman begins to change. He eats healthy food. He does his homework. He becomes calm and compliant. The transformation is so complete that even the other children notice it. For a brief period, Eric Cartman is a normal, functioning child. This should be the happy ending. This should be the moment where the family heals and moves forward. But that is not what happens. What happens instead reveals the true nature of the Cartman family dynamic. Cesar Millan finishes his work and prepares to leave. Leon, who has developed feelings for Milan during his time working with the family, asks if he would like to see an opera with her. Milan politely declines. He explains that she is a client, not a friend, and that his job is done. He leaves, and Leanne is devastated. Not because she lost a parenting consultant, because she lost the only adult companionship she had. Leanne is profoundly lonely. She is a single mother with no partner, no close friends, and no support system. The only constant relationship in her life is with her son, and when Milan leaves, Leanne turns immediately back to the one person who is always there. She asks Cartman if he wants to go to the opera with her instead. When he refuses, she bribes him. She says she will buy him a new toy if he goes. He asks for 2 toys. She agrees. She tells him he can have whatever he wants. And just like that, the entire transformation is undone. Cartman's expression shifts. That sinister, knowing smile returns. The old Cartman is back. Not because he chose to revert, but because his mother's loneliness overrode her ability to maintain the structure he needed. This is the core tragedy of Eric Cartman's psychology. His behavior was fixable. Cesar Millan proved it. Given consistent authority, clear boundaries, and sustained structure, Cartman is capable of prosocial behavior. He can be a normal child, but his mother cannot maintain those conditions because her emotional needs take priority over his developmental needs. She needs Cartman to be her companion, her friend, her source of emotional comfort. And a well-behaved child who follows rules and respects boundaries does not serve that function. An obedient child does not fill the void in Leon's life the way a dependent, enmeshed child does. So she unconsciously sabotages every opportunity for change because change would mean losing the only relationship that makes her loneliness bearable. Trey Parker, one of the creators of South Park, has said this explicitly in interviews. He stated that Cartman is just a product of his environment and that the show was built on the observation that overly sweet, indulgent parents are the ones making really evil kids. Parker identified Leanne as the primary cause of Cartman's behavior, not genetics, not some innate evil, but the specific way his mother raised him. But Leon's failures go even deeper than permissive parenting and emotional enmeshment. Her personal issues create an environment that exposes Cartman to experiences no child should have. Throughout the series, it is established that Leanne has a history of substance abuse, including crack cocaine. She has worked in the sex industry and has appeared in pornographic material. She brings various men into the home, exposing Cartman to sexual content and potentially dangerous individuals. There are implications throughout the series, some subtle and some not subtle at all, that Cartman has been exposed to or directly experienced sexual abuse connected to his mother's lifestyle. He has referenced reporting his mother's boyfriends to the police. He has made statements about experiences that, stripped of their comedic context, describe sexual trauma. The show plays these moments for dark humor, but a psychologist would take them very seriously. When researchers study adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, they use a framework that identifies specific types of childhood trauma and their cumulative impact on development. The original AC study identified 10 categories of adverse experience, including physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation, and incarceration of a household member. Each ACE a child experiences increases their statistical risk for behavioral problems, mental health issues, substance abuse, and criminal behavior in adulthood. And the effects are cumulative. A child with 4 or more ACEs is dramatically more likely to develop serious problems than a child with 1 or 2. By conservative estimate, Eric Cartman has at least 6 or 7 ACEs. Emotional neglect disguised as permissiveness. Exposure to substance abuse in the household. Absent father. Exposure to his mother's sexual activity. Possible sexual abuse from mother's partners. Potential physical abuse from the same. And the general chaos and instability of a household run by a single mother with active addiction issues and no support system. This ACE score alone, without any other factors, would predict severe behavioral and psychological problems. Combined with the permissive parenting style, the emotional enmeshment, and the complete absence of a father figure, the prediction becomes nearly certain. A psychologist examining Leon would see a woman who genuinely loves her son, but who is so damaged by her own unresolved issues that her love manifests as harm. She is not a bad person. She is not intentionally creating a monster. She is a lonely, struggling woman doing the best she can with severely limited psychological resources. But the impact on Cartman is devastating regardless of her intentions. The road to hell, as the saying goes, and the road to conduct disorder in your child is paved with material indulgence, absent boundaries, and love that prioritizes the parent's emotional needs over the child's developmental needs. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But Leanne is only half the equation. The other half is defined by absence. Because behind every psychological evaluation of Eric Cartman lies a question that haunts the entire series. What happens to a child who grows up without a father? And what happens when that child discovers he unknowingly murdered the father he never had? For the first 13 seasons of South Park, the identity of Eric Cartman's father was treated as a running joke. In the season 1 finale, Cartman's mom is a dirty slut. The entire episode revolves around trying to determine who fathered Eric, but the mystery is played for comedy because Leanne has been intimate with virtually every eligible man in town, as well as the entire Denver Broncos football team. The question was left deliberately unanswered, then further muddied in season 2 when it was claimed that Leanne herself was intersex and was technically both Cartman's mother and father. For years, the show treated Cartman's paternity as either a joke or an unsolvable mystery, but a psychologist would not find it funny at all. Because not knowing who your father is creates a specific type of psychological wound that affects identity formation in profound ways. Children construct their sense of self partly from understanding where they come from. They look at their parents and see reflections of themselves. They learn about who they are by learning about who made them. When half of that equation is missing, when a child has no information about their father, no relationship with him, no understanding of that part of their heritage, it creates what psychologists call an identity lacuna, a gap in the foundation of the self that other psychological structures must build around, like a house constructed around a hole in the ground. The research on father absence is extensive and consistently troubling. Children who grow up without fathers are statistically more likely to exhibit behavioral problems, struggle with authority figures, demonstrate aggressive behavior, have difficulty with emotional regulation, and develop problems with impulse control. They are more likely to have trouble forming healthy relationships, particularly with male authority figures. They are more likely to engage in criminal behavior, and they are more likely to repeat the pattern of absence in their own families, perpetuating the cycle across generations. Cartman fits every single one of these statistical predictions. His problems with authority are legendary. He constantly challenges teachers, police officers, and any adult who attempts to exert control over him. His aggressive behavior is the defining feature of his character. His emotional regulation is virtually non-existent. He swings from calm manipulation to explosive rage in seconds when his ego is threatened. His impulse control, while sometimes suspended during elaborate long-term schemes, is generally poor. He acts on desires immediately and expects instant gratification. His obsession with authority is particularly revealing. The phrase, "respect my authority," is one of the most famous lines in television history, and it is usually played for comedy. But from a psychological perspective, it reveals something deeply significant about Cartman's inner world. He is obsessed with having authority because he grew up in a household where no authority existed. His mother provided no structure, no hierarchy, no rules. There was no father to model masculine authority or to demonstrate how power and responsibility worked together. Cartman experienced a childhood vacuum of authority, and he has spent his entire life trying to fill it, not by submitting to authority, which would require trust and vulnerability, but by seizing it for himself. This is a well-documented pattern in children of absent fathers. They do not learn to navigate authority structures because they never experience functional authority at home. They either become excessively submissive, craving the structure they never had, or excessively dominant, attempting to create the authority they were denied. Cartman chose dominance. He appointed himself the authority figure in every situation. He demands that others respect his power, his position, his importance. He creates hierarchies with himself at the top. He cannot tolerate being subordinate to anyone because subordination requires trust in the person above you. And Cartman has never had reason to trust that authority figures will be competent, consistent, or present. Then comes the revelation that changes everything. In the season 14 episodes 200 and 201, the truth about Cartman's father is finally revealed. His biological father was Jack Tenorman, a player for the Denver Broncos who had an affair with Leanne Cartman. Jack Tenorman is also the father of Scott Tenorman, which means Scott Tenorman is Eric Cartman's half-brother, which means that in Scott Tenorman Must Die, when Cartman orchestrated the deaths of Scott's parents and fed them to Scott in Chile, he was killing his own biological father and feeding him to his own half-brother. Let that information settle for a moment, not as a plot twist, but as a psychological event. Eric Cartman unknowingly committed patricide. He murdered the father he never knew. He dismembered his father's body with a hacksaw. He cooked his father into food. He fed his father to his half-brother. And he did all of this without knowing any of these relationships existed because his mother had lied to him about his paternity for his entire life. When Cartman finally learns the truth in episode 201, his reaction is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in the entire series. He does not express horror at having killed his own father. He does not show grief or guilt or shock at the magnitude of what he has done. Instead, he is horrified that being Jack Tenorman's son makes him half ginger because Scott Tenorman has red hair. A psychologist would immediately recognize this as displacement, one of the classic defense mechanisms first described by Sigmund Freud. Displacement occurs when a person cannot psychologically process an overwhelming emotion, so they redirect that emotion toward a safer, less threatening target. The reality that Cartman killed his own father is so psychologically overwhelming, so fundamentally destabilizing to his sense of self, that his mind cannot process it directly. So it redirects the emotional energy toward a trivial concern, his fear of being ginger, which is manageable, and does not threaten his psychological structure the way confronting patricide would. This displacement serves a protective function. If Cartman were to fully process that he murdered his own father, he would have to confront several devastating truths simultaneously. That his mother lied to him about something fundamental to his identity. That his elaborate revenge scheme, the one he considers his greatest achievement, was actually the worst thing he has ever done in a way he did not even understand at the time. That the father he never had was a real person whose life he ended. And that the identity gap he has been building around his entire life could have been filled, that he could have had a father if circumstances had been different. Any one of these realizations would be devastating. All of them together would be psychologically catastrophic. So Cartman's mind does what traumatized minds do. It protects itself. It deflects. It finds something small and manageable to worry about instead of the enormous identity-shattering truth. He worries about being ginger because worrying about being ginger does not require him to dismantle his entire self-concept. But the father wound does not just manifest in this single moment. It runs through Cartman's entire behavioral pattern like a fracture line through a building's foundation. His desperate need for significance, his compulsion to control others, his inability to form genuine connections, his exploitation of anyone who shows him kindness, all of these can be understood as attempts to compensate for the fundamental absence at the center of his identity. He never had a father to teach him how to be a person. He never had a male authority figure to model healthy behavior. He never had someone to set limits and enforce consequences and demonstrate that rules exist because people matter, not just because authority says so. What he had instead was a mother who gave him everything except what he needed, a community that treated his paternity as a joke, and eventually the knowledge, buried under layers of defensive displacement, that he destroyed the one person who could have filled the void at the center of his life. The father absence did not just deprive Cartman of a parent. It deprived him of the developmental scaffolding that would have allowed him to become a functional human being. And the revelation about Jack Tennerman did not just add tragedy to his backstory. It confirmed, in the most horrifying way possible, that the void would never be filled. There is another dimension of the father wound that we need to examine, and it has to do with how boys construct their understanding of masculinity in the absence of a father. Because Cartman's behavior is not just antisocial, it is specifically recognizably masculine in the worst possible ways. His aggression, his dominance seeking, his obsession with authority and power, his contempt for vulnerability, his belief that emotional expression is weakness, all of these are distorted expressions of masculinity. And the question a psychologist would ask is, where did he learn them? In a typical developmental trajectory, boys learn about masculinity primarily from their fathers or father figures. They learn what it means to be male by watching how a man navigates the world. They learn about strength by watching a father be strong. They learn about gentleness by watching a father be gentle. They learn about emotional expression by watching a father process emotions in healthy ways. They learn about relationships by watching how a father treats a mother, treats friends, treats strangers. The father is the primary template for masculine identity. When the father is absent, the template is missing. But the need for a masculine identity does not disappear. It is a developmental imperative. The boy still needs to figure out what it means to be male. He still needs to construct a version of masculinity that he can embody. And without a father to provide that template, he turns to the other available sources: media, peers, cultural stereotypes, and whatever fragments of masculine behavior he encounters in his environment. Cartman's version of masculinity is built almost entirely from these secondary sources, and it shows. His concept of what it means to be a man is a caricature assembled from action movies, television stereotypes, and the aggressive dominance displays he has observed in the males around him. He equates masculinity with dominance. He equates strength with the ability to hurt others. He equates authority with the right to control. He equates emotional expression with weakness that invites exploitation. None of these equations are accurate. They are distortions, funhouse mirror reflections of actual masculine qualities. But they are the best approximations he could construct without anyone to teach him otherwise. His obsession with physical toughness, despite being physically unfit, is particularly revealing. Cartman frequently presents himself as a warrior, a fighter, a dominant physical presence, despite the fact that he is regularly beaten in physical confrontations and is objectively one of the least physically capable members of his peer group. This disconnect between self-perception and reality would, in a healthy child, produce embarrassment or motivation to improve. In Cartman, it produces neither. Instead, his narcissistic structure simply overwrites the reality with the preferred narrative. He is tough because he says he is tough. His body is irrelevant. His fight record is irrelevant. The narrative is what matters. In the episode Good Times with Weapons, Cartman and the boys acquire martial arts weapons from a flea market and engage in an extended fantasy sequence where they imagine themselves as anime-style warriors. The episode alternates between the boys' fantasy perceptions of themselves and the reality of what they actually look like, which is 4 ordinary children waving sticks around in a backyard. For the other boys, the fantasy is play. It is imagination. It is fun. For Cartman, there is a sense that the line between fantasy and reality is thinner. His fantasy self is not just a game. It is closer to his actual self-concept than his physical reality is. This ties back to the father absence in a direct way. Boys who grow up with fathers get regular daily reality checks about what masculinity looks like in practice. They see a man who is strong but also sometimes tired, who is authoritative but also sometimes uncertain, who is capable of anger but also capable of tenderness. The lived example of a real father provides complexity, nuance, and contradiction. It teaches the boy that masculinity is multidimensional, that a man can be both strong and vulnerable, both decisive and thoughtful, both protective and gentle. Without that lived example, the boy is left with the simplified, exaggerated templates provided by culture. And those templates, especially the ones that were available to a child growing up in the kind of media-saturated, unsupervised environment that Cartman inhabits, tend to be heavy on dominance, aggression, and emotional suppression, and light on everything else. Cartman did not just lose a father. He lost the nuanced model of masculinity that would have balanced his understanding of what it means to be male. And the version he built from scraps is not just distorted, it is dangerous. It is a version of masculinity that equates power with worth, dominance with strength, and cruelty with effectiveness. And it is a version that his environment, lacking any competing male influence, has never challenged. The Broncos connection adds one more layer to this analysis. Jack Tenorman, Cartman's biological father, was a professional football player. Football in American culture represents one of the most visible and celebrated expressions of traditional masculinity. Strength, aggression, competition, physical dominance, team loyalty, these are the values that professional football embodies. If Cartman had known his father, if he had grown up watching his dad play for the Broncos, he would have had access to a specific model of masculinity. It might not have been perfect. Professional athletes are not automatically good fathers, but it would have been real. It would have been three-dimensional. It would have been a starting point. Instead, Cartman got nothing. And then, in the cruelest possible irony, he destroyed the father he never knew before he ever had the chance to meet him. The template that could have given his masculine identity structure and dimension was eliminated by Cartman's own hand, in service of a revenge scheme that itself was driven by the very identity deficits that a father might have prevented. The circularity is devastating. The absence of the father produced the psychology that destroyed the father, which ensured the absence would be permanent. It is a closed loop of loss that can never be broken because the key to breaking it was destroyed before Cartman even knew it existed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But the absent father explains the void. The permissive mother explains the lack of boundaries. What fills the space between them is something far darker. Because Cartman did not just grow up without structure. He grew up learning that manipulation is the single most effective tool for navigating the world. And the sophistication of his manipulation reveals a mind that operates at a level that would genuinely concern any clinician who encountered it. There is a concept in personality psychology called the dark triad. It was introduced by researchers Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams in 2002. And it describes three overlapping but distinct personality traits that, when combined, produce individuals who are exceptionally effective at exploiting others. The three traits are narcissism, which provides the motivation. The person believes they deserve whatever they want. Machiavellianism, which provides the method. The person is willing to manipulate strategically to get it. And psychopathy, which removes the brakes. The person feels no guilt or empathy that would stop them from crossing moral lines. Eric Cartman exhibits all three traits at levels that would be remarkable in an adult, let alone a child. His narcissism is obvious and has already been discussed. His Machiavellianism is demonstrated through scheme after scheme that requires sophisticated strategic thinking. And his psychopathic traits manifest as the absence of genuine remorse, the callous disregard for other suffering, and the superficial charm he deploys when manipulation requires it. But the clearest window into how Cartman's manipulation actually works, the episode that functions as a masterclass in applied dark psychology, is Scott Tenorman Must Die. And to understand why a psychologist would find this episode so alarming, we need to walk through the scheme step by step, not as a comedy plot, but as evidence of a clinical profile. Cartman's initial response to being scammed by Scott is typical of a child with conduct disorder. He tries direct approaches. He attempts to get his money back through confrontation, through bargaining, through simple tricks. All of them fail. Scott is older, smarter in conventional terms, and has the social advantage of being a teenager dealing with a much younger child. Every attempt Cartman makes is met with further humiliation. Scott burns the money in front of him. Scott films Cartman dancing like a pig and shows the video to the entire town. Cartman is publicly degraded in ways that attack the core of his narcissistic self-image. This is the critical moment. For a typical child, even a badly behaved one, this level of humiliation would produce anger, crying, avoidance, or perhaps a complaint to an adult. For Cartman, it produces something else entirely. It produces calculation. When the humiliation crosses a certain threshold, Cartman does not escalate emotionally. He becomes cold. He becomes strategic. He begins operating on a completely different level, planning not just a response, but an elaborate system of interlocking manipulations designed to produce maximum devastation. The plan itself demonstrates several features that a psychologist would flag as deeply concerning. First, it involves multiple simultaneous manipulations of different people who do not know they are being manipulated. Cartman manipulates his friends Stan and Kyle. He manipulates Scott Tenorman. He manipulates Farmer Denkins. He manipulates Radiohead. Each manipulation is tailored to the specific psychology of the target. He knows Stan and Kyle will betray him, so he incorporates their betrayal into the plan. He knows Scott will try to counter his apparent scheme, so he plants a fake scheme as a decoy. He knows Farmer Denkins will shoot trespassers, so he creates conditions that put Scott's parents on Denkins' property. He knows Radiohead will make fun of a crying fan, so he invites them to arrive at the exact moment Scott will be at his most devastated. Second, the plan demonstrates long-term strategic thinking that would be impressive from an adult military strategist, let alone a 9-year-old child. Cartman does not just plan one move ahead. He plans multiple moves ahead, accounting for the actions of people who do not know they are part of the plan, predicting betrayals before they happen, and building contingencies into the scheme that make failure nearly impossible. Third, and this is the part that separates Cartman from merely clever children, the plan's ultimate goal is not practical. He does not gain money, power, or status from the scheme. The goal is the psychological destruction of another human being. The goal is to make Scott Tenorman experience the absolute worst emotional devastation a person can feel, the discovery that he has eaten his own parents, and to experience that devastation publicly in front of people whose opinion he cares about. The plan is designed to produce suffering. That is its purpose, and Cartman derives genuine pleasure from that suffering. The final moments of the episode are what would most concern a clinician. After the reveal, after Scott discovers the truth and begins sobbing, Cartman does not show satisfaction in the way a normal person might feel satisfaction after successfully completing a difficult task. He shows ecstasy. He climbs on the table. He sings. He physically approaches his victim and licks the tears from his face while narrating his own pleasure. He says, "Let me taste your tears of unfathomable sadness." This is not revenge. This is sadistic enjoyment of another person's pain, which is one of the most concerning behavioral markers a psychologist can observe in any patient at any age. Albert Bandura's social learning theory helps explain how Cartman developed these capabilities. Bandura argued that behavior is learned primarily through observation, imitation, and reinforcement. Children learn how to behave by watching what works for the people around them and then replicating those strategies. They continue behaviors that produce positive outcomes and abandon behaviors that produce negative outcomes. Cartman's environment has taught him through thousands of interactions that manipulation works. When he whines, his mother gives in. That is positive reinforcement for manipulative behavior. When he bullies classmates, they submit or avoid him. That is positive reinforcement for dominance behavior. When he lies, he avoids consequences. That is negative reinforcement for deception. And critically, when he executes elaborate schemes, he achieves his goals while his opponents suffer. That is the most powerful reinforcement of all, because it teaches him that sophisticated manipulation is not just effective, but superior to other strategies. Nobody ever consistently demonstrated to Cartman that honest, direct, empathetic behavior produces better outcomes than manipulation. His mother modeled avoidance and people-pleasing. His peers modeled that the strongest personality in the room gets what they want. His absent father modeled nothing at all, and the community around him modeled that extreme behavior is either ignored or temporarily punished before everyone forgets about it and moves on. In this environment, manipulation is not just a choice. It is the rational strategy. Cartman is doing exactly what his environment taught him to do. His exploitation of Butters' stotch provides the clearest example of how this plays out in everyday relationships. Butters is the perfect target for a manipulator. He is trusting, compliant, eager to please, desperate for friendship, and incapable of recognizing when he is being used. Cartman identifies these vulnerabilities and exploits them systematically. He uses Butters as a fall guy when schemes go wrong. He uses Butters as a minion when he needs someone to do his bidding. He uses Butters as an audience when he needs someone to witness his brilliance. And he provides nothing genuine in return. The relationship is entirely extractive. In the episode Osimo, Cartman disguises himself as a robot to gain Butters' trust and extract embarrassing secrets he can later use against him. He maintains the disguise for an extended period, enduring significant discomfort because the potential payoff of having blackmail material on Butters is worth the investment. This is cost-benefit analysis applied to interpersonal relationships, the kind of calculation that defines Machiavellian personality traits. Cartman evaluates every relationship in terms of what he can extract from it. People are not people to him. They are resources to be managed. In Casa Bonita, Cartman wants to attend Kyle's birthday party at a restaurant he loves, but Kyle deliberately does not invite him because of their antagonistic relationship. Cartman's response is to convince Butters that a meteor is about to destroy the Earth, hide Butters in a bomb shelter, and take his spot at the party. He allows Butters to believe that everyone he loves is dead, that civilization has collapsed, that he is one of the last people alive, also Cartman can eat at a restaurant. When the deception is eventually discovered and Butters is rescued, traumatized, and distraught, Cartman shows no remorse. He got what he wanted. The cost to Butters is irrelevant. A psychologist would point out that Cartman's manipulation is not just a behavior, it is a worldview. He has internalized a model of human relationships where exploitation is normal, empathy is weakness, and other people exist primarily as tools to be used in service of his own goals. This worldview did not appear from nowhere. It was constructed piece by piece by an environment that never taught him anything different. His mother modeled that relationships are about getting your emotional needs met by the other person. His absent father modeled that people who are supposed to be there for you simply are not. His community modeled that bad behavior has no lasting consequences. And his own repeated success with manipulation confirmed over and over again that this worldview is accurate and effective. The tragedy is that Cartman is not stupid. He is deeply intelligent. He understands human psychology better than almost anyone around him. If that intelligence had been guided by a competent parent, channeled by a present father, shaped by consistent boundaries and genuine consequences, it could have been directed toward positive ends. Cartman could have been a leader, an entrepreneur, a strategist who uses his understanding of human nature to help people rather than exploit them. Instead, that intelligence was shaped by an environment that rewarded cruelty and punished nothing. And it became the engine of one of the most elaborate manipulation systems ever depicted in fiction. We have talked about the diagnosis. We have talked about the mother. We have talked about the absent father and the machinery of manipulation. But there is a layer underneath all of those that a psychologist would consider essential to understanding Eric Cartman. And it is one of the most misunderstood aspects of his character. We need to talk about his narcissism, not the surface-level narcissism that everybody sees, the bragging and the demands for respect, and the grandiose declarations of superiority. We need to talk about what is underneath it. Because underneath the grandiosity, underneath the inflated self-image and the relentless self-promotion, lies something that Cartman will never voluntarily reveal and would violently deny if confronted with it. Underneath all of it, Eric Cartman is empty. This is a critical distinction in clinical psychology. There are two broad models for understanding narcissistic presentation. The first is sometimes called grandiose narcissism or overt narcissism. This is the kind everyone recognizes. The person genuinely believes they are superior, acts accordingly, and experiences positive emotions associated with their self-image. They feel good about themselves. Their grandiosity is not a mask. It is their actual experience of the world. The second model is called vulnerable narcissism or covert narcissism, and it looks very different underneath the surface. In this model, the grandiose behavior is a defensive structure built on top of a fragile, insecure, and often deeply wounded self. The person acts superior because they cannot tolerate the alternative. If the grandiosity is stripped away, if the person is forced to confront their actual self-image without the protective layer of inflated ego, what remains is not confidence but terror. Terror of being worthless. Terror of being insignificant. Terror of being exactly what they secretly suspect they are. Cartman shows clear evidence of the vulnerable model. His grandiosity is not calm and secure. It is brittle and reactive. A person with genuine, stable, high self-esteem does not explode into rage when someone calls them fat. A person who truly believes they are superior does not need to constantly remind everyone around them of that superiority. A person with real confidence does not need to destroy anyone who challenges their self-image. The intensity of Cartman's reactions to ego threats is itself diagnostic. It reveals that the grandiosity is a wall, and behind the wall is something he cannot face. His weight is the clearest window into this dynamic. Cartman is visibly overweight. This is an observable, undeniable physical fact. Every character in the show can see it. Cartman cannot, or more precisely, Cartman will not. He insists with absolute conviction and volcanic anger that he is not fat. He is big-boned. He has a different body type. He is perfectly healthy, and anyone who says otherwise is wrong, jealous, or attacking him for no reason. This is not simple denial. This is a narcissistic defense protecting a core wound. Cartman's weight represents everything he cannot control about himself. His mother fed him whatever he wanted because feeding him was easier than parenting him. His body is the physical evidence of her failure, a visible record of every time she chose indulgence over discipline, every time she handed him junk food instead of setting a boundary. His weight is, in a very real sense, the shape of his neglect made visible. And somewhere underneath the bluster, underneath the denial and the rage, Cartman knows this. He has to. The information is right there every time he looks in a mirror. But knowing it and being able to process it are two very different things. Cartman cannot process the reality of his weight because doing so would require him to confront everything the weight represents. It would mean admitting that his mother's love was not really love, at least not the kind that protects and nurtures a child. It would mean admitting that he is not special and superior but damaged and neglected. It would mean dismantling the entire psychological structure he has built to survive his environment. And so the narcissistic defense holds. The wall stays up. He is not fat. He is big-boned, and anyone who says otherwise will pay. The episode Cartman Land provides another revealing look at how his narcissism operates. In this episode, Cartman inherits $1 million from his grandmother and uses it to purchase an amusement park. His explicit reason for buying the park is so that he can enjoy it alone, without other people ruining his experience by being present. He names it Cartman Land, and for a brief period, he achieves something close to his ideal existence. A world that revolves entirely around him, with no other people to disappoint him, challenge him, or threaten his self-image. A psychologist would recognize this as narcissistic fantasy made literal. Cartman does not want a world where he is the most important person. He wants a world where he is the only person. Other people, in Cartman's psychological framework, exist primarily as threats. They might criticize him. They might see through his defenses. They might expose the emptiness underneath. They might be better than him at something, which would threaten his grandiose self-image. The safest world, the world where Cartman's narcissistic structure is never threatened, is a world with no one else in it. Of course, the park fails because Cartman is forced to admit paying customers to cover operating costs, which eventually makes the park popular, which defeats the entire purpose of owning it. He ends up losing everything, but the fantasy itself reveals the depth of his narcissistic need. He would literally rather be alone in a world built for himself than share any space with other people whose existence might challenge his self-concept. His relationship with Kyle Broflovsky adds yet another dimension to the narcissism picture. On the surface, Cartman hates Kyle. He mocks Kyle's Jewish heritage constantly. He belittles Kyle at every opportunity. He schemes against Kyle more than any other character. Their antagonism is one of the defining dynamics of the show. But a psychologist would look at this relationship and see something far more complex than hatred. Cartman needs Kyle. He needs Kyle the way a narcissist needs what clinicians call narcissistic supply, a term for the attention, reactions, and emotional energy that narcissistic individuals extract from the people around them to sustain their self-image. Kyle is Cartman's primary source of narcissistic supply because Kyle is the only person who consistently takes Cartman seriously. Stan often ignores Cartman or dismisses him with mild irritation. Kenny is usually passive. Butters is too naive to provide meaningful opposition. But Kyle engages. Kyle argues. Kyle gets angry. Kyle is morally outraged by Cartman's behavior. Kyle cares about whether Cartman is right or wrong, good or bad, telling the truth or lying. Kyle treats Cartman as significant enough to be worth fighting with. And that significance is what Cartman feeds on. Every argument with Kyle confirms that Cartman matters. Every moral outrage confirms that Cartman has power. Every time Kyle is upset by something Cartman said or did, it proves that Cartman can affect the world around him, that his existence has impact, that he is not the insignificant, worthless child that the emptiness inside him whispers he might be. Cartman does not antagonize Kyle despite their relationship. He antagonizes Kyle because of it. Kyle is the mirror that reflects back the version of himself that Cartman needs to see. A person of consequence, a person who affects others, a person who cannot be ignored. This is why Cartman's rare moments of apparent warmth toward Kyle are so psychologically interesting. There are scattered moments across the series where Cartman shows something that looks almost like affection or concern for Kyle. He has saved Kyle's life on occasion, albeit usually for self-interested reasons. He has shown distress when Kyle was genuinely in danger. He has occasionally demonstrated that he knows Kyle better than anyone else in the group, understanding Kyle's psychology with the same precision he applies to his manipulation targets. These moments suggest that underneath the antagonism there is an attachment, not a healthy one, not one that produces mutual benefit, but an attachment nonetheless, born from the fact that Kyle is the closest thing Cartman has to someone who sees him, truly sees him, not the grandiose persona, but the actual person underneath. The episode 1% contains what might be the most important narcissistic crisis in the entire series. In this episode, Cartman's fitness scores bring down the class average so severely that the entire school is punished with additional exercise requirements. The other students are furious. They openly blame Cartman, and Cartman, unable to accept that his weight and fitness are causing a real, measurable public problem, begins to psychologically fragment. Over the course of the episode, Cartman's stuffed animals, which he still sleeps with and talks to at age 9 or 10, begin to die. One by one, they are destroyed. Cartman initially blames others for killing his stuffed animals, launching investigations and accusing various classmates. But the episode gradually reveals what the audience suspects from the beginning. Cartman himself is destroying the stuffed animals. He is doing it unconsciously, or at least semi-consciously, because the stuffed animals represent his childhood self, the vulnerable, dependent, immature part of himself that the fitness test has publicly exposed. This is psychologically sophisticated storytelling. What the episode depicts is an internal conflict between Cartman's narcissistic structure and the reality that structure is designed to hide. The fitness test forced reality into the open. Cartman is fat. He is unhealthy. His body does not work the way other children's bodies work. These are facts, and they were made publicly undeniable. His narcissistic defenses, the denial, the insistence that he is big-boned, the rage at anyone who mentions his weight, were not enough to protect him from a standardized test that measured everyone equally. The destruction of the stuffed animals is Cartman's way of resolving this crisis. He cannot accept his vulnerability. He cannot integrate the knowledge that he is physically inferior to his classmates. So instead, he destroys the symbols of vulnerability. He murders his own childhood. He kills the soft, dependent parts of himself that the world has shown him are weaknesses. And at the end of the episode, when all the stuffed animals are gone, what remains is a Cartman who has doubled down on the narcissistic structure, who has become harder and more defended than before, who has traded what little softness he had left for a more impenetrable wall of grandiosity. A psychologist would watch that episode and feel genuine sadness because what it depicts is a child making himself worse in order to survive. The narcissistic defense is not healthy. It isolates him from genuine connection. It prevents him from developing real self-awareness. It turns every relationship into a transaction. But within the context of Cartman's life, it serves a function. It protects him from a truth that he has no support system to help him process. The truth that he is a neglected, overweight, fatherless child whose mother's love was never the kind that could actually help him grow. The narcissism is not the disease. It is the bandage over a wound that never received proper treatment. And like all untreated wounds, it has become infected, spreading poison into every other aspect of his psychological functioning. There is one more thread connecting Cartman's narcissism to his deeper psychological wounds that we have touched on, but not fully explored. His relationship with food, because food in the Cartman household is not just sustenance. It is not just comfort. It is the primary medium through which the entire dysfunctional dynamic between Cartman and his mother operates. Food is how Leon expresses love. Food is how Cartman receives love. Food is the currency of their enmeshed relationship, the substance that fills the space where boundaries, discipline, and genuine emotional connection should be. Developmental psychologists have long recognized that feeding practices are one of the earliest and most important arenas where the parent-child relationship takes shape. How a parent feeds a child, when and what and how much sends messages about control, autonomy, responsiveness, and care. In healthy feeding relationships, the parent provides nutritious food at appropriate times and in appropriate amounts, responding to the child's hunger cues while also setting limits. The child learns that their needs will be met, but within a structure that teaches self-regulation. In the Cartman household, feeding follows none of these healthy patterns. Leanne gives Cartman whatever food he wants, whenever he wants it, in whatever quantity he demands. Cheesy poofs, KFC, snacky cakes, powdered donut pancake surprise. The food is almost exclusively processed, calorie-dense, and nutritionally poor. And the feeding pattern is entirely demand-driven. Cartman demands, Leanne provides. There is no structure. There is no limit. There is no teaching of self-regulation. This pattern produces several interconnected consequences that feed directly into Cartman's psychological profile. First, it prevents the development of interoceptive awareness, which is the ability to accurately perceive and respond to your body's internal signals. Children who are fed on demand without any structure often struggle to distinguish between hunger, boredom, anxiety, loneliness, and other internal states. They learn to use food as a universal response to all internal discomfort, because food is what their environment has trained them to associate with the relief of discomfort. When Cartman is anxious, he eats. When he is bored, he eats. When he is lonely, he eats. When he is angry, he eats. Food has become his primary self-regulation tool because his mother never taught him any other way to manage internal states. Second, the feeding dynamic creates a physiological reinforcement loop that parallels the psychological one. High-sugar, high-fat foods produce a dopamine response in the brain that is neurochemically similar to the response produced by addictive substances. When Leanne gives Cartman cheesy poofs to stop a tantrum, she is not just giving in psychologically. She is providing a substance that temporarily alters his brain chemistry in a way that reduces distress. The tantrum stops not just because Cartman got what he wanted, but because the food itself has a calming, mood-regulating effect. This creates a powerful conditioning loop. Distress leads to demanding food. Demanding food leads to receiving food. Receiving food leads to temporary neurochemical relief, and the relief reinforces the entire cycle. Third, and this connects directly to the narcissism discussion, Cartman's weight becomes the physical evidence of the entire dysfunctional system made visible on his body. Every extra pound is a record of a boundary that was not set, a limit that was not enforced, a moment when Leon chose the path of least resistance instead of the path of responsible parenting. Cartman carries his mother's failure on his body, visible to everyone, undeniable by any objective measure. This is why his weight is the narcissistic wound that triggers the most explosive reactions. Other insults, other challenges to his self-image can be deflected with bluster and rationalization. But his weight cannot be argued away. It is there. It is measurable. It has consequences that he cannot deny, as we saw in the 1% episode when his fitness scores brought down the entire class average. His weight is the crack in his narcissistic wall that lets reality seep through, and he responds to any mention of it with the ferocity of someone defending not just their self-image, but their entire psychological structure from collapse. In the episode Fat Camp, Cartman is sent to a weight loss camp, which should in theory be a positive intervention. But the episode reveals how thoroughly food and identity have become intertwined in his psychology. Rather than engaging with the program, Cartman runs an underground smuggling operation to bring junk food into the camp for other campers. He literally cannot stop the cycle even when removed from his home environment, because the cycle is not just about food anymore. It is about control, identity, and the only reliable source of comfort he has ever known. A psychologist specializing in eating behavior would look at Cartman and see a child whose relationship with food is not a separate issue from his other psychological problems. It is the physical manifestation of all of them simultaneously. The permissive parenting is written in every snack provided without question. The emotional neglect is written in every meal used as a substitute for genuine emotional connection. The absent father is written in the absence of anyone who might have modeled self-discipline or introduced structure to the household's eating patterns. The narcissistic defense is written in the denial that the weight exists at all. And the enmeshment is written in the fact that food is the primary love language of the only relationship that matters in Cartman's life. His body tells his whole story if you know how to read it. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this. Now, we have spent a long time discussing how Cartman relates to himself through narcissism and manipulation. But we need to examine how he relates to other people. Because his attachment patterns, the way he forms and maintains bonds with others, reveal something that cuts even deeper than the grandiosity. They reveal a child who desperately wants connection but has absolutely no idea how to achieve it without destroying it in the process. Attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, is one of the most important frameworks in developmental psychology. The core idea is that children develop internal working models of relationships based on their earliest experiences with caregivers. If a caregiver is consistently responsive, warm, and reliable, the child develops what is called secure attachment. They learn that relationships are safe, that people can be trusted, that expressing vulnerability will be met with support rather than rejection or exploitation. If the caregiver is inconsistent, sometimes responsive and sometimes not, available on their own terms rather than the child's, the child develops what is called insecure ambivalent attachment, sometimes also called anxious attachment. These children learn that relationships are unpredictable, that you cannot count on people being there when you need them. That love comes and goes based on the other person's mood or circumstances. They become hypervigilant about relationship cues, constantly monitoring whether the other person is available or withdrawing. They often become clingy and demanding, trying to force the reliability that should come naturally. And if the caregiver is consistently unavailable, rejecting, or frightening, the child develops insecure avoidant attachment. These children learn that relationships are inherently unsafe and that the only person you can rely on is yourself. They become emotionally independent not because they do not need connection, but because they have learned that seeking connection leads to pain. There's also a fourth category called disorganized attachment, which occurs when the caregiver is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of fear. This creates an impossible situation for the child. The person they need to run to for safety is the same person they need to run from. Children with disorganized attachment often show contradictory behaviors, approaching and retreating simultaneously, freezing in place, or engaging in bizarre, self-contradictory actions that reflect the impossible bind they are caught in. Cartman shows features of several insecure attachment styles, but his primary pattern is best described as insecure ambivalent with significant disorganized features. His mother is his primary attachment figure, and she is profoundly inconsistent. She is physically present but emotionally absent. She provides material comfort but no psychological structure. She is warm and affectionate on the surface, but uses that warmth to serve her own emotional needs rather than her child's developmental needs. She is simultaneously the only source of love in Cartman's life and a source of chronic developmental harm. This creates exactly the kind of contradictory internal working model that produces severe attachment disruption. Cartman has learned that love and neglect come from the same person, that warmth and failure coexist in the same relationship, that the person who is supposed to protect you is also the person most responsible for your damage. He cannot resolve this contradiction, so he carries it into every other relationship in his life. Look at how Cartman relates to the boys in the group, Stan, Kyle, and Kenny. These are, by default, his closest friends. They are the people he spends the most time with. They go on adventures together. They sit at the same lunch table. In any normal friendship, this level of proximity and shared experience would produce genuine bonds of mutual affection and loyalty. But Cartman does not have normal friendships. He has arrangements. The episode The Death of Eric Cartman makes this painfully clear. When the boys decide to ignore Cartman entirely, refusing to speak to him or acknowledge his existence as punishment for eating all the skin off a bucket of fried chicken, Cartman does not understand what is happening. He believes he has died and become a ghost. This is played for comedy, and it is very funny, but underneath the humor lies a devastating psychological truth. Cartman is so accustomed to being tolerated rather than genuinely liked, so aware on some level that his presence in the group is based on proximity and habit rather than actual affection, that when the other boys simply stop acknowledging him, his first interpretation is that he must be dead. Because in his internal working model, the only reason someone would completely stop engaging with him is if he literally no longer exists. No one in the group genuinely chooses Cartman. Stan tolerates him. Kyle actively dislikes him but is stuck with him because of the social structure of their community. Kenny is too passive and economically disadvantaged to exercise real social choice. The only person who consistently seeks out Cartman's company is Butters, and Butters does so because Butters is desperate enough for friendship to accept exploitation as the price of admission. Cartman does not have friends. He has hostages. His relationship with Heidi Turner during seasons 20 and 21 provides the most extended and psychologically realistic depiction of how Cartman's attachment style operates in a romantic context. When Cartman and Heidi begin dating, there is an initial period that looks almost healthy. Cartman appears to genuinely like Heidi. He shows vulnerability with her. He seems to be trying, in his limited way, to be a good partner. Heidi, who is smart and kind, responds to this vulnerability with warmth and acceptance. But the relationship gradually deteriorates into a textbook abuse cycle. Cartman becomes controlling. He undermines Heidi's self-esteem. He isolates her from her friends. He gaslights her when she raises concerns about his behavior. He alternates between sweet, vulnerable, affectionate behavior and cruel, dismissive, degrading behavior, creating a pattern of intermittent reinforcement that is one of the hallmarks of abusive relationships. Heidi, trapped in this cycle, begins to change. She becomes more like Cartman. She gains weight. She becomes meaner. She loses her sense of self. A psychologist would recognize this pattern immediately. Cartman cannot maintain a healthy relationship because his attachment style does not allow for it. The initial vulnerability he shows with Heidi is real, but it is unsustainable. Being vulnerable means opening yourself to the possibility of being hurt, and Cartman's entire psychological structure is built around avoiding pain. So when the relationship inevitably introduces conflict, when Heidi disagrees with him or challenges him or fails to perfectly mirror his needs, his defense mechanisms activate. He cannot tolerate the threat, so he eliminates it, not by leaving the relationship, but by destroying the parts of Heidi that threaten him. He reshapes her into someone who cannot challenge his narcissistic structure. He turns his partner into an extension of himself, which is the only kind of relationship his attachment style can sustain. The Heidi relationship also reveals Cartman's fundamental loneliness, which is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of his character. For all his bluster, for all his schemes and demands and grandiose declarations, Eric Cartman is profoundly alone. He has no genuine friends. His mother's love is a form of neglect. His father's dead, killed by Cartman's own hand. His romantic relationship devolved into mutual destruction. The only living creature he shows consistent, apparently genuine affection for is his cat, Mr. Kitty, who is incapable of judging him, challenging his self-image, or exposing his vulnerability. There is a specific psychological theory about why people with Cartman's attachment style often prefer animals to humans. Animals provide unconditional positive regard without the threat of evaluation. Mr. Kitty does not care if Cartman is fat. Mr. Kitty does not challenge his authority. Mr. Kitty does not see through his manipulation. Mr. Kitty provides warmth and companionship without any of the interpersonal risks that make human relationships so threatening to someone with Cartman's psychological profile. At the bottom of everything, underneath the conduct disorder and the narcissism and the manipulation and the grandiosity, there's a child who wants what every child wants: to be loved, to be accepted, to belong. But every tool he has developed for pursuing those needs pushes the actual fulfillment of them further away. His manipulation drives people away or turns them into victims rather than partners. His narcissism prevents the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy. His attachment disruption means he cannot trust the very people he needs to trust in order to form real bonds. He is caught in a trap that his environment built for him, reaching for connection with hands that only know how to grab, squeeze, and break. Before we get into defense mechanisms, there are two more relationships that deserve psychological attention because they reveal dimensions of Cartman's attachment style that the Heidi and Butters dynamics do not fully capture. Cartman's relationship with Stan Marsh is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic Cartman-Kyle dynamic, but it is psychologically significant precisely because of how unremarkable it appears to be. Stan is the group's emotional center. He is the most well-adjusted of the four boys, the one with the most functional family life, the one whose moral compass generally points in the right direction even when he is confused or overwhelmed. Stan represents within the group what normal looks like, and Cartman's behavior towards Stan reveals how he relates to normalcy itself. Cartman does not hate Stan the way he claims to hate Kyle. He does not obsess over Stan. He does not need Stan's reactions to fuel his narcissistic supply. Instead, Cartman mostly ignores Stan's authority, dismisses Stan's opinions, and treats Stan as an obstacle to be worked around rather than a person to be engaged with. When Stan tries to be the voice of reason, Cartman talks over him. When Stan objects to a scheme on moral grounds, Cartman redirects the conversation. When Stan challenges him directly, Cartman deflects rather than escalates. A psychologist would find this pattern interesting, because it suggests that Cartman does not know what to do with people who are simply normal. Kyle's moral outrage is something Cartman can work with. It provides energy, conflict, and narcissistic supply. Butters' naivety is something Cartman can exploit. Kenny's passivity is something Cartman can ignore. But Stan's grounded, relatively healthy personality offers Cartman nothing to grab onto. There is no vulnerability to exploit, no emotional intensity to feed off, no naivety to manipulate. Stan is just a regular kid who sometimes disagrees with Cartman, and regular kids who simply disagree without providing emotional intensity are, to Cartman, essentially invisible. This is revealing because it shows that Cartman's engagement with others is almost entirely driven by what he can extract from them. When there is nothing to extract, there is no engagement. Stan gets the emotional equivalent of being looked through. Cartman's relationship with Kenny McCormick is more layered and in some ways more psychologically revealing than any of his other relationships. Kenny is the poorest member of the group. His family lives in poverty. His clothing is ragged. He is the lowest status member of the friend group by virtually every social metric. And Cartman, who is obsessed with status and hierarchy, treats Kenny accordingly. He mocks Kenny's poverty. He uses Kenny's lower social status to feel better about his own position. He assigns Kenny the worst roles in group activities. He treats Kenny as expendable. And yet, there are moments, scattered and inconsistent but real, where Cartman's behavior toward Kenny suggests something that looks like actual attachment, not the exploitative attachment he has with Butters, not the narcissistic supply relationship he has with Kyle, something quieter and harder to categorize. When Kenny dies, Cartman's reactions, while initially formulaic, sometimes shade into something that appears genuine. There are episodes where Cartman refers to Kenny as his best friend, and while this claim is often self-serving, there is a pattern underneath it that a psychologist would notice. Kenny is the one member of the group who does not judge Cartman. Stan disapproves of Cartman on moral grounds. Kyle actively opposes him. Butters is too naive to properly evaluate him. But Kenny, who has seen everything and endured worse poverty and hardship than anyone else in the group, simply accepts Cartman as he is. Kenny does not try to change Cartman. Kenny does not lecture him. Kenny does not engage in moral arguments about Cartman's behavior. Kenny just exists alongside him, present but not demanding, available but not threatening. For a child with Cartman's attachment profile, this kind of quiet, non-judgmental presence is the closest thing to safety that any relationship can provide. Kenny does not trigger Cartman's narcissistic defenses because Kenny does not challenge his self-image. Kenny does not trigger his abandonment fears because Kenny keeps showing up. Kenny does not trigger his need for control because Kenny is already compliant by temperament and circumstance. In an attachment landscape filled with threats and triggers, Kenny is the closest thing Cartman has to a safe harbor. And the fact that Cartman seems dimly aware of this, that he sometimes treats Kenny with a gentleness he shows no one else, suggests that somewhere beneath all the defensive armor, there is a part of Cartman that recognizes and values genuine safety in a relationship, even if he has no idea how to reciprocate it in a healthy way. Now, there is one more dimension of Cartman's inner life that reveals how his attachment wounds and narcissistic needs interact, and that is his fantasy life. Cartman's imagination is not just active, it is voracious. He constructs elaborate fantasy worlds, adopts personas, creates narratives in which he is the hero, the leader, the most important person in whatever scenario he has invented. The Imagination Land episodes make this literal, but the pattern runs through the entire series. Cartman as a pirate captain, Cartman as a Civil War general, Cartman as an evangelical minister, Cartman as a wrestling promoter, Cartman as a music producer, Cartman as a border patrol agent. The specifics change. The underlying structure does not. In every fantasy, Cartman occupies the center. In every fantasy, he is in control. In every fantasy, the world operates according to his rules. A psychologist would recognize this as compensatory fantasy, a well-documented phenomenon in children who feel powerless or insignificant in their real lives. The fantasy world provides what the real world does not. In reality, Cartman is a fatherless, overweight child with no real friends, raised by a mother who cannot provide structure. In fantasy, he is powerful, admired, authoritative, and in command. The gap between the two worlds is the measure of his psychological need. The wider the gap, the greater the need, and in Cartman's case, the gap is enormous. But compensatory fantasy becomes a problem when it starts substituting for real engagement with the world rather than supplementing it. Healthy children use fantasy play to process emotions, practice social skills, and explore possibilities. The fantasy serves development. In Cartman's case, the fantasy increasingly serves avoidance. Rather than confronting the painful realities of his life, rather than developing real skills for navigating real relationships, he retreats into constructed worlds where the painful realities do not exist. Each fantasy is an escape from the emptiness, the loneliness, and the inadequacy that define his actual experience. And because the fantasy feels better than reality, because it provides the significance and control that reality denies him, the pull toward fantasy grows stronger over time, while the motivation to engage with reality grows weaker. This is the same dynamic seen in adults who become addicted to substances or behaviors that provide temporary relief from emotional pain. The relief is real. It works. It makes the pain stop for a while. But it does not fix anything. The pain is still there when the fantasy ends. And over time, the person needs more and more fantasy to achieve the same relief, while their capacity for tolerating reality without the fantasy continues to deteriorate. Cartman's elaborate schemes can actually be understood through this lens. His schemes are not just manipulation. They are fantasy constructions that he attempts to impose on reality. The Scott Tenorman scheme is a fantasy of ultimate revenge made real. The Cartman Land scheme is a fantasy of total narcissistic control made real. The various hate campaigns are fantasies of group dominance made real. What distinguishes Cartman from an ordinary child who daydreams about being important is that Cartman does not just imagine these scenarios. He attempts to implement them. He tries to force reality to match his fantasy. And when it works, when reality bends to match the constructed narrative in his head, it produces the most intense gratification he is capable of experiencing. It is the moment when the empty, insignificant, fatherless child disappears, and the powerful, brilliant, feared Cartman takes his place. The fact that the gratification is temporary, that reality always reasserts itself, that the schemes always eventually collapse or produce consequences he did not anticipate, does not diminish the pull. If anything, the temporary nature of the gratification drives him to pursue bigger, more elaborate, more extreme fantasies, chasing a permanent version of the relief that can only ever be temporary. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now, every person develops psychological defense mechanisms. These are unconscious strategies the mind uses to protect itself from thoughts, feelings, and realities that are too threatening to process directly. Healthy people use defenses occasionally and flexibly, deploying them when needed and releasing them when the threat passes. But when a person's environment is consistently threatening, when the things they need to defend against are not temporary crises but permanent features of their daily existence, the defenses become rigid. They become automatic. They become eventually inseparable from the person's personality itself. And that is exactly what has happened with Eric Cartman. Cartman's defense mechanisms are not occasional strategies. They are his operating system. They run constantly, automatically, and they are so deeply embedded in his personality that distinguishing between Cartman and his defenses is nearly impossible. Understanding which defenses he uses and how they interact with each other provides one of the clearest windows into his inner life. The most obvious and pervasive defense is denial. Cartman uses denial the way other people use breathing. It is constant and automatic. He denies being fat. He denies wrongdoing even when caught in the act. He denies that his schemes have failed even when the failure is visible to everyone. He denies that people dislike him. He denies that his mother is anything other than a wonderful parent. He denies, constructing an alternative version of reality that protects his self-image from the constant assault of actual reality. But Cartman's denial goes beyond simple refusal to acknowledge facts. It operates at a level that suggests genuine distortion of perception. When he looks in the mirror, he may genuinely not see what everyone else sees. When he insists he is not fat but big-boned, he may not be lying in the traditional sense. He may be experiencing a version of reality that has been so thoroughly filtered through his defensive structure that the filtered version is, subjectively, the real one. This is the difference between lying, which requires awareness of the truth, and denial, which replaces the truth with a more bearable alternative. Projection is his second major defense, and it works hand in hand with denial. Projection involves attributing your own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or qualities to someone else. When Cartman calls other people stupid, he is projecting his own hidden fear that he is not as clever as he believes. When he accuses others of being selfish, he is projecting his own selfishness onto them. When he targets Kyle with anti-Semitic attacks, he is projecting his own sense of being an outsider, of not belonging, onto someone whose outsider status is more visible and socially acceptable to attack. The Kyle dynamic is particularly revealing when viewed through the lens of projection. Cartman is obsessed with Kyle's Jewish identity. He makes it a constant subject of mockery, ridicule, and conspiratorial accusation. From a psychological perspective, this obsession with Kyle's perceived otherness is almost certainly a projection of Cartman's own deep-seated feeling of not belonging. Cartman does not fit in. He is overweight in a group of normal-sized children. He is cruel in a community that, for all its dysfunction, generally operates on some baseline of social cooperation. He is fatherless. He is the child everyone tolerates but nobody chooses. His sense of being different, of being outside, of not really belonging to the group is one of his most painful and most buried feelings. By projecting that sense of otherness onto Kyle, by making Kyle the outsider, Cartman momentarily relieves his own pain of exclusion. Rationalization is the third pillar of Cartman's defensive structure. Rationalization involves creating logical-sounding justifications for behavior that is actually driven by irrational or unacceptable motives. Cartman is a master rationalizer. Every scheme, every cruelty, every act of exploitation comes wrapped in a justification that, within Cartman's distorted framework, makes perfect sense. When he feeds Scott Tenorman his parents, it is justified because Scott humiliated him first. When he manipulates Butters, it is justified because Butters is stupid enough to be manipulated and therefore deserves it. When he leads a hate campaign against an ethnic or religious group, it is justified by elaborate conspiracy theories that he has constructed to explain why his hatred is actually rational analysis. The rationalizations are never convincing to outside observers, but they do not need to be. They only need to be convincing to Cartman himself, and within his defensive structure, they serve that function perfectly. Reaction formation is a more subtle defense, and it is visible primarily in his relationship with Kyle. Reaction formation occurs when a person converts an unacceptable feeling into its opposite. If Cartman has any genuine attachment to Kyle, any sense that Kyle is important to him in ways that go beyond narcissistic supply, then his extreme hostility toward Kyle can be understood partly as reaction formation. The positive feeling is unacceptable because it represents vulnerability, so it is converted into hostility, which feels safer and more consistent with Cartman's self-image. This is why certain moments between Cartman and Kyle carry such odd emotional weight. There are instances where Cartman's antagonism toward Kyle tips over into something that looks almost like desperate engagement. Like he needs Kyle's attention so badly that negative attention is preferable to none at all. The line between hating someone and needing someone can be very thin, and Cartman walks that line with Kyle constantly. But the defense mechanism that reveals the most about Cartman's inner world is the one we see in the episode 1%, which we discussed earlier. When Cartman begins unconsciously destroying his own stuffed animals, he is engaging in a form of dissociation, combined with what psychoanalysts call acting out. He is performing an internal psychological process through external physical action. The stuffed animals represent his vulnerable self, the part of him that is still a child, still soft, still capable of being hurt. By destroying them, he is symbolically killing the parts of himself that his environment has shown him are liabilities. And here is the detail that is both subtle and devastating. During the destruction of the stuffed animals, Cartman is not fully aware that he is doing it. He genuinely investigates who is killing his toys. He accuses classmates. He grieves each loss. The dissociation is real. Part of his mind is carrying out the destruction, while another part is genuinely shocked and saddened by it. This split, this ability to simultaneously perform an action and be unaware that you are performing it, suggests a level of dissociation that would concern any clinician. It indicates that the internal conflict between Cartman's vulnerable self and his defensive structure has become so severe that his mind has fragmented around it. The episode Fish Sticks provides another window into how Cartman's defenses distort his memory and perception. In this episode, Jimmy Valmer creates a joke that becomes enormously popular. Cartman, who was present when Jimmy wrote it but contributed nothing, gradually convinces himself that he co-wrote the joke. Then he convinces himself that he wrote it alone. Then he convinces himself that Jimmy stole it from him. By the end of the episode, Cartman's memory of the event has been so thoroughly rewritten by his defensive structure that he genuinely believes his fabricated version. He takes a lie detector test and passes because to his mind, the lie has become the truth. This is not ordinary lying. This is a defensive reconstruction of reality so complete that it overrides actual memory. Psychologists who study this phenomenon call it confabulation when it occurs in neurological patients, but in personality disordered individuals, it serves the same function as any other defense mechanism. It protects the self from threatening information. The truth that Cartman contributed nothing while someone else created something brilliant is intolerable to his narcissistic structure. So the structure rewrites reality, not after the fact, not as a conscious choice to lie, but in real time, reprocessing incoming information so that by the time it reaches Cartman's conscious awareness, it has already been edited into a version that supports his self-image. The cumulative picture of Cartman's defense mechanisms reveals something that is more pitiable than frightening, though it is certainly both. His mind is working overtime all the time to construct and maintain a version of reality that he can tolerate living in. The real reality in which he is an overweight, friendless, fatherless child with a neglectful mother and no one who genuinely loves him in the way he needs, is so painful that his entire psychological apparatus is devoted to keeping it at bay. Every denial, every projection, every rationalization, every dissociated act is a brick in a wall built between Cartman and a truth he cannot survive confronting. And as long as that wall holds, he will continue to function. But functioning in Cartman's case means manipulating, exploiting, and destroying. The defenses that protect him from his pain are the same mechanisms that cause pain to everyone around him. He is simultaneously the victim of his own psychology and the perpetrator of harm toward others, trapped in a system where protecting himself requires hurting other people. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this. Now, one of the mistakes people make when analyzing a character like Cartman is to focus entirely on the individual. They look at his symptoms, his defense mechanisms, his personality traits, and they try to understand him as a self-contained psychological unit. But human beings do not exist in isolation. They exist in systems. And to fully understand Eric Cartman, we need to zoom out from the individual and look at the system that surrounds him. Because that system is not just failing to fix Cartman, it is actively maintaining his dysfunction. Family systems theory, developed primarily by Murray Bowen in the 1960s and 1970s, proposes that the family operates as an emotional unit. Individual members of the family cannot be understood in isolation because their behavior is shaped by, and in turn shapes, the behavior of every other member. The family is like a mobile, one of those hanging sculptures where touching any single piece causes every other piece to move. You cannot change one person in the family without affecting everyone else. And you cannot understand one person's behavior without understanding how it fits into the larger family pattern. The Cartman family system, reduced to its simplest form, is a dyad, two people, Eric and Leon. And that simplicity is itself part of the problem because healthy families require more than two members to function properly. In a functional family with two parents, the parental couple forms a subsystem that shares the emotional burden of running the household, makes collaborative decisions about discipline and structure, and provides each other with the adult companionship that prevents either parent from turning to their children to meet emotional needs. When one parent is absent, all of those functions default to the remaining parent, who rarely has the resources to handle them alone. Leon has no partner. She has no co-parent. She has no one to share the emotional burden of raising a profoundly difficult child. And she has no one to provide her with the adult companionship she needs. So she turns to the only person available. She turns to Cartman, and in doing so, she creates what family therapists call enmeshment, a condition where the boundaries between parent and child dissolve and the two become psychologically fused. In an enmeshed dyad, the parent and child are not two people in relationship. They are one emotional unit. The child's job is not to grow, individuate, and develop independence. The child's job is to meet the parent's emotional needs, to keep the parent from being lonely, to be the parent's friend, confidant, and companion. In return, the parent meets the child's material needs, often excessively, because material provision is both easier and more immediately gratifying than the hard work of setting boundaries and enforcing consequences. This describes the Cartman household precisely, where Leanne provides everything Cartman wants materially: food, toys, entertainment, freedom from rules. Cartman provides everything Leon wants emotionally: companionship, the feeling of being needed, a relationship that will never leave her. Neither person is getting what they actually need. Cartman needs boundaries, structure, and someone willing to tolerate his anger when those boundaries are enforced. Leanne needs adult relationships, professional support, and treatment for her own psychological issues. But both are getting what they want in the moment, and the immediate comfort of getting what you want is often enough to prevent people from pursuing the harder, slower process of getting what they need. But the Cartman family system does not exist in a vacuum. It is embedded in a larger community system, and that community has failed just as thoroughly as the family. Consider the adults who interact with Cartman regularly. Mr. Garrison, his teacher, is himself profoundly disturbed. cycling through identity crises, personal vendettas, and behavior that would result in immediate termination at any real school. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor, provides generic, ineffective guidance that never addresses the severity of Cartman's issues. He says drugs are bad, McKay, and fighting is bad, McKay, without ever engaging with the underlying causes of the behaviors he is supposedly counseling students about. Principal Victoria and later PC principal manage the school in ways that prioritize institutional reputation over student welfare. The police, represented primarily by Officer Barbrady, are incompetent. Social services appear to be non-existent in South Park. The medical establishment, represented by various doctors throughout the series, treats symptoms without investigating causes. The religious community, represented by Father Maxey, is too consumed with its own scandals and hypocrisy to provide meaningful moral guidance. Every institution that is supposed to identify and intervene when a child is in trouble has failed with Eric Cartman. Not once, not occasionally, consistently and completely across his entire childhood. This systemic failure is not accidental. It is the natural result of how systems maintain themselves. Family systems theory recognizes a concept called homeostasis, which is the tendency of any system to resist change and maintain its current equilibrium even when that equilibrium is dysfunctional. The Cartman family system has achieved a stable equilibrium. It is not a healthy equilibrium. It produces a child with severe conduct disorder and a mother with unresolved personal issues. But it is stable. Everyone knows their role. The patterns are established. The system runs itself. When anything threatens to disrupt this equilibrium, the system pushes back. We saw this in TSST. Cesar Millan disrupted the family equilibrium by introducing structure and authority. Cartman began changing. The system was becoming healthier, but Leanne could not tolerate the change because the healthier system did not meet her emotional needs. So the system snapped back to its dysfunctional equilibrium. Millan left. Boundaries dissolved. Cartman reverted. Homeostasis restored. The broader community system does the same thing. When Cartman's behavior becomes too extreme to ignore, the community responds with temporary, superficial interventions that address the immediate crisis without touching the underlying dynamics. He is punished briefly. He is lectured ineffectively. He is sent to programs or subjected to interventions that have no lasting impact because they operate on the individual without addressing the system. And then the crisis passes, everyone returns to their default positions, and the pattern continues. A family therapist evaluating the Cartman case would say that individual therapy for Eric would be necessary but insufficient. You cannot fix a child while leaving them embedded in the system that broke them. Meaningful change would require treating the entire system simultaneously. Leanne would need therapy for her own issues, including her substance abuse, her enmeshment with Cartman, and whatever underlying trauma drives her need for her son to serve as her emotional partner. Cartman would need individual therapy focused on developing empathy, impulse control, and healthier relationship patterns. The family would need therapy together to establish appropriate boundaries and restructure the parent-child dynamic. And the school and community systems would need to be brought into the treatment plan, providing consistent reinforcement of new patterns across all of Cartman's environments. None of this will ever happen in South Park because the show is a comedy and the dysfunction is the point. But the fact that we can articulate exactly what would need to change and why it never will tells us something important about Cartman's character. He is not a random collection of bad behaviors. He is the predictable output of a dysfunctional system operating exactly as it was designed to operate, or more accurately, exactly as it defaulted to operating when every safety mechanism failed. The system created Cartman, the system maintains Cartman, and the system will continue producing the Cartman we know until someone intervenes at the system level rather than the individual level. And the tragedy of the character, the real tragedy underneath all the comedy, is that no one in his world has the awareness, the resources, or the motivation to do that. Before we move to how Cartman justifies his behavior, there is one more systemic layer that deepens our understanding of why the Cartman household operates the way it does. We need to talk about intergenerational transmission of dysfunction, because Leanne Cartman was not born a bad parent any more than Eric was born a bad child. She was made by her own history, by her own environment, by the same kinds of failures that she is now perpetuating with her son. The show provides limited but revealing glimpses into Leon's background and the extended Cartman family. What we see is not encouraging. The Cartman family, as depicted across various episodes, appears to have a multi-generational pattern of dysfunction that includes substance abuse, criminal behavior, and a general inability to maintain stable, healthy family structures. The episode Merry Christmas, Charlie Manson introduces several members of Cartman's extended family, and the picture that emerges is one of pervasive instability. Criminal behavior appears normalized within the family system. Boundaries between family members are blurred or absent. The adults model exactly the kinds of behavior that we see magnified in Cartman's generation. This matters because intergenerational transmission of dysfunction is one of the most robustly documented phenomena in developmental psychology. Parents who are not adequately parented themselves often struggle to parent their own children effectively. Not because they do not want to do better, but because they literally do not have the internal model for what better looks like. You cannot teach what you were never taught. You cannot provide what you never received. And so patterns repeat, generation after generation, each iteration potentially adding new layers of damage while carrying forward the unresolved damage from previous generations. Leanne's inability to set boundaries with Cartman almost certainly reflects an upbringing in which boundaries were not modeled for her. Her substance abuse suggests a family system in which substance use was normalized or at least inadequately addressed. Her enmeshment with Cartman, her use of her child as an emotional partner, suggests that she experienced something similar in her own childhood, learning that the boundary between parent and child is something flexible, something negotiable, something that exists to serve the emotional needs of the adults rather than the developmental needs of the children. There is a clinical concept called the family projection process, originally described by Murray Bowen, which helps explain how dysfunction passes from one generation to the next. In this process, a parent's own unresolved emotional issues become focused on a particular child who then absorbs those issues and carries them forward. The parent is usually unaware that this is happening. They are not deliberately passing their damage to their child. They are simply interacting with their child in the only way they know how, which is the way they were interacted with. And in doing so, they replicate the pattern. Leanne projects her loneliness onto Cartman by making him her companion. She projects her need for control by eliminating all structure, ensuring that Cartman remains dependent on her. She projects her fear of abandonment by never saying no, never risking his anger, never allowing conflict that might temporarily push them apart. Each of these projections serves Leanne's emotional needs while simultaneously damaging Cartman's development. And Leanne cannot stop doing it because she does not see it. She sees a loving mother and a happy child. She does not see an enmeshed dyad replicating a multi-generational pattern of relational dysfunction. If Cartman were to grow up and have children of his own, and this is where the analysis becomes truly chilling, the prediction is that he would either perpetuate the cycle or produce its mirror image. Children of parents with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits are at elevated risk for developing similar traits themselves through a combination of genetic vulnerability and environmental modeling. But they are also at elevated risk for the opposite outcome, developing anxious, avoidant, or dependent personality structures as a response to the chaos and cruelty of their upbringing. Either way, the damage propagates. The cycle continues, and each generation adds its own particular twist to the inherited pattern of dysfunction. The post-COVID specials play with this possibility by showing Cartman as a father, apparently reformed, raising apparently healthy children. If the reform is genuine, it would represent the rarest and most hopeful possible outcome. A break in the intergenerational chain, a person who somehow managed to become a better parent than the one who raised them despite having every reason to fail. If the reform is a scheme, it would represent the opposite, a continuation of the pattern in a new form. Manipulation and exploitation dressed in the clothing of family values. A new generation being raised not with genuine love, but with the appearance of love constructed as part of a longer game. The show leaves the question deliberately unanswered, and from a psychological perspective, that is the most honest choice the writers could have made. Because in real clinical practice, the question of whether intergenerational patterns can be broken is never answered with certainty. Sometimes they can, sometimes they cannot. Sometimes the break looks real but collapses under stress. Sometimes what looks like continuation gradually transforms into genuine change. The ambiguity of real human development resists the neat conclusions that fiction usually demands, and the post-COVID specials honor that ambiguity by refusing to resolve it. What we can say with confidence is that the intergenerational context does not excuse Cartman's behavior. Understanding why a person became the way they are does not obligate us to accept the harm they cause. Liane's damage explains her parenting failures, but does not make those failures acceptable. Cartman's environmental history explains his cruelty, but does not make his cruelty tolerable. Explanation is not exoneration. It is context. And the context in Cartman's case is one of cascading failure across multiple generations and multiple systems, each failure making the next one more likely, each generation passing its damage to the next with the grim reliability of a river following its channel downhill. We have examined what Cartman does, how his environment created him, and how his psychology maintains itself through defense mechanisms and family systems. But there is a question we have not yet addressed directly, and it is perhaps the most important one. How does he justify it to himself? How does a human being, even a deeply damaged one, look at their own behavior that includes feeding a boy his own parents, psychologically tormenting classmates, leading hate campaigns against entire groups of people, and not feel the weight of what they have done? The answer lies in a framework that psychologist Albert Bandura called moral disengagement. And Cartman is one of the most thorough practitioners of moral disengagement you will ever encounter in fiction or reality. Bandura identified 8 specific mechanisms that people use to disconnect their behavior from their moral standards. These mechanisms do not eliminate the person's knowledge of right and wrong. They do not destroy the moral compass. Instead, they create a buffer between the compass and the behavior, allowing the person to act in ways that violate their own moral standards without experiencing the guilt and self-condemnation that should follow. The first mechanism is moral justification. This involves reframing harmful behavior as serving a higher moral purpose. Cartman does this constantly. When he organizes campaigns against Jewish people or other minority groups, he frames his bigotry as necessary for the protection of society. In The Passion of the Jew, after seeing Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, Cartman becomes convinced that he is carrying out a righteous crusade. He dresses in a uniform reminiscent of Nazi iconography and leads a group through town chanting in German. He does not see himself as engaging in hate. He sees himself as a visionary fighting for what is right. The moral justification mechanism allows him to recast blatant bigotry as heroism. The second mechanism is euphemistic labeling, which involves using sanitized language to make harmful behavior seem less severe. Cartman does not say he manipulated Butters. He says he was helping Butters understand the situation. He does not say he stole something. He says he liberated it or commandeered it. He does not say he hurt someone. He says they had it coming or he taught them a lesson. The language softens the reality, making it easier for Cartman to avoid confronting the actual nature of his actions. The third mechanism is advantageous comparison, which involves comparing your behavior to something worse to make it seem acceptable by contrast. When confronted about something awful he has done, Cartman will frequently point to someone who did something worse, or invoke a hypothetical scenario that makes his behavior look mild in comparison. The message is always the same. What I did is not that bad. Other people have done much worse. You are overreacting. The fourth mechanism is displacement of responsibility. Cartman is a virtuoso at this. He almost never accepts that his actions are his own choice. Someone provoked him. Someone left him no alternative. The system forced his hand. Scott Tenorman started it by selling him pubic hair. Kyle provoked him by being Jewish and annoying. Butters volunteered for exploitation by being too trusting. In Cartman's moral framework, responsibility for his behavior always belongs to someone else. He is simply responding to circumstances that other people created. The fifth mechanism is diffusion of responsibility, which spreads accountability across a group so that no single person feels responsible. Cartman frequently recruits others into his schemes, not just because he needs help, but because having accomplices dilutes his own sense of responsibility. If everyone participated, then no one is particularly to blame. In Ginger Kids, when Cartman leads a campaign declaring that gingers are subhuman and should be segregated, he mobilizes an entire group of children behind the movement. The group involvement makes it easier for every individual participant, including Cartman, to feel that they are simply going along with a collective action rather than personally choosing to harm others. The sixth mechanism is distortion of consequences, which involves minimizing, ignoring, or misrepresenting the harm that your behavior causes. Cartman is extraordinarily good at this. He consistently fails to acknowledge the severity of the suffering he causes. When people cry, he sees weakness rather than pain. When people are traumatized, he sees overreaction rather than legitimate distress. When permanent damage results from his actions, he sees an acceptable outcome rather than a tragedy. His perception of consequences is so thoroughly distorted that he appears genuinely confused when people are upset about things that any normal person would recognize as devastating. The seventh mechanism is dehumanization, which involves stripping the victim of their human qualities so that moral standards no longer feel applicable. This is where Cartman's bigotry serves a psychological function beyond simple prejudice. When he dehumanizes Jewish people, or gingers, or any other group he targets, he is not just expressing hatred. He is reclassifying his victims so that the normal rules of human decency no longer apply to them. You do not have to feel guilty about mistreating someone if you have convinced yourself they are not fully human. Cartman's prejudice is not incidental to his psychology. It is a tool, a mechanism that allows him to cause harm without the moral weight that would normally accompany it. The eighth and final mechanism is attribution of blame, which places responsibility for the harm on the victim themselves. The victim deserved it. The victim provoked it. The victim should have known better. Cartman deploys this mechanism with almost every person he wrongs. Scott Tenorman was the one who started the conflict. Kyle brings the anti-Semitism on himself by being so annoyingly Jewish. Butters is responsible for his own exploitation because he is dumb enough to fall for it. The blame is always placed on the person who was harmed, never on the person who caused the harm. What makes Cartman's moral disengagement so complete and so clinically significant is that he does not use these mechanisms one at a time. He uses all of them simultaneously, layered on top of each other to create a moral buffer so thick that virtually no empathetic signal can penetrate it. For any given harmful act, Cartman can simultaneously justify it morally, label it euphemistically, compare it favorably to worse things, displace responsibility onto others, diffuse it through group action, minimize the consequences, dehumanize the victim, and blame the victim for their own suffering. Each mechanism reinforces the others, creating a self-sustaining system of moral evasion that would take years of therapy to dismantle. The Passion of the Jew episode is the clearest single example of moral disengagement operating at full capacity. Cartman takes inspiration from the film. He reframes anti-Semitic ideology as righteous purpose, which is moral justification. He uses language that casts his movement as spiritual awakening rather than hate, which is euphemistic labeling. He points to what he perceives as Jewish control of media and finance as worse than anything he is doing, which is advantageous comparison. He claims the film and its message compelled him, which is displacement of responsibility. He recruits a group, which is diffusion of responsibility. He ignores or minimizes the real fear and harm his actions cause, which is distortion of consequences. He dehumanizes Jewish people as a category, and he blames Kyle for being the kind of person who provokes this response. Every single one of Bandura's 8 mechanisms operating at once in a 9-year-old child. That is not casual misbehavior. That is a fully developed moral disengagement system that would typically be seen only in adults with extensive histories of antisocial behavior. And it was built, like everything else in Cartman's psychology, by an environment that never challenged it. No one in Cartman's life has ever consistently required him to confront the moral reality of his actions. His mother excuses everything. His school punishes sporadically and ineffectively. His friends eventually move on and forget. The community absorbs each outrage and returns to normal. Without sustained moral accountability, without someone who consistently and firmly says, this is wrong and here's why and there will be consequences, moral disengagement grows unchecked. And in Cartman, it has grown into something comprehensive and deeply entrenched. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this. Now, I want to spend some time on something that complicates everything we have discussed so far. Because if Eric Cartman were nothing but a diagnostic checklist, nothing but conduct disorder and narcissism and moral disengagement stacked on top of each other, he would not be as psychologically interesting as he is. What makes him interesting, what makes him worth this level of analysis, is that he is not a pure sociopath. There are cracks. There are moments where something else breaks through. And those moments are, from a clinical perspective, the most important data points in his entire behavioral record. Go back to the episodes one more time. When Cesar Millan successfully establishes authority over Cartman, the transformation is not just behavioral. It appears to be emotional. Cartman does not just comply with rules the way a frightened child complies with a strict disciplinarian. He appears to feel better. He seems calmer, more settled. He makes eye contact with his mother in a way that looks like genuine warmth rather than manipulation. He eats healthy food without being forced. He does homework without complaint. The change is profound and pervasive in a way that suggests it is not just a surface-level behavioral modification. Something inside Cartman shifted when consistent authority was provided. This matters enormously from a clinical perspective because it demonstrates capacity. Cartman is capable of pro-social behavior. He is capable of functioning within rules. He is capable of experiencing positive emotions associated with structure and boundaries rather than resistance to them. The ability is there. The hardware exists. What has been missing is the environment that activates it. Tst proves that with the right conditions, Cartman can change. And it also proves, when Leon undoes the change within hours, that the environment will not allow it. The episode 1% provides another crack in the armor, and this one is darker and more complex. During the episode, as Cartman's stuffed animals are being destroyed one by one, there is a scene where Cartman's Polly Prissy Pants, one of his remaining stuffed animals, appears to speak to him. In what we can interpret as an externalization of Cartman's own conscience, Polly Prissy Pants tells him he should not kill the remaining stuffed animals. She tries to talk him out of continuing the destruction. Cartman is visibly conflicted. He is struggling. Something inside him does not want to do what his defensive structure is demanding he do. He kills Polly Prissy Pants anyway. The defensive structure wins, but the struggle itself is significant. If Cartman were a true psychopath, if he genuinely had no moral capacity whatsoever, there would be no struggle. He would destroy the stuffed animals without internal conflict, the way a person throws away garbage. The fact that a part of him resists, the fact that his mind generates a voice arguing against the destruction, means that the moral capacity exists. It is being overridden consistently and effectively by his defensive structure. But it is there. Cartman's reactions to Kenny's deaths throughout the series provide another data point. Kenny dies regularly in the earlier seasons of South Park, and the boys' reactions vary. Stan typically says, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," and Kyle responds, "You bastards." It is a running gag, but there are moments scattered across the series where Cartman shows what appears to be genuine distress at Kenny's death. Moments that go beyond the formulaic response and suggest real emotional pain. In the episode Kenny Dies, Cartman appears to be devastated by Kenny's illness and impending death. He cries. He visits Kenny in the hospital. He gives what seems like a heartfelt speech about their friendship. Now, the episode ultimately reveals that Cartman's real motive was to use Kenny's situation to advance a scheme involving stem cell research. The tears were at least partly manipulative, but here is the thing that makes this psychologically interesting. Were they entirely manipulative? Can we be sure that none of Cartman's emotional display was genuine? A skilled clinician would say, no, we cannot be sure. Because in people with Cartman's profile, manipulation and genuine emotion are not mutually exclusive. They coexist. A person can be genuinely sad about a friend's suffering and simultaneously calculating how to exploit that suffering. The two processes run in parallel, and the person may not be fully aware of either one. This mixture of genuine feeling and manipulative calculation is one of the hallmarks of the kind of personality structure we see in Cartman. He is not a robot. He is not empty of all feeling. He has emotions. He has, buried under layers of defense and distortion, the capacity for empathy. But those emotions are so tangled with his defensive structure, so thoroughly interwoven with his patterns of exploitation and self-interest, that extracting the genuine from the manipulative is nearly impossible. For outside observers, and probably for Cartman himself, the South Park post-COVID special and its sequel provide the most extended glimpse of what Cartman's future might look like, and the psychological implications are fascinating. In this timeline set decades in the future, Cartman appears to have reformed completely. He has converted to Judaism, become a rabbi, married a Jewish woman, and has well-adjusted children. He appears kind, patient, and genuinely transformed. Kyle, naturally suspicious, given decades of experience with Cartman's schemes, cannot accept that the change is real. He believes it must be an elaborate long con. The special leaves this question deliberately ambiguous. Is reformed Cartman genuine, or is he running the longest scheme of his life? And the psychological answer is that both interpretations are valid because both are possible. Given what we know about Cartman's personality, complete genuine reform is possible, but unlikely without intensive therapeutic intervention, which may have occurred off-screen. Simultaneously, an elaborate, decades-long manipulation scheme is also possible, because Cartman has demonstrated the patience and strategic sophistication required to sustain such a deception. But from a strictly clinical standpoint, the more interesting question is not whether the reform is real. It is whether the distinction matters. If Cartman has behaved like a good person for decades, if he has raised functional children, maintained a loving marriage, contributed to his community, is the inner experience of whether his kindness is genuine versus performed actually relevant? Some psychologists would argue that sustained pro-social behavior, regardless of its internal motivation, eventually shapes internal experience. Behave kindly long enough and kindness becomes part of who you are, even if it started as a performance. Others would argue that the absence of genuine internal change means the performance can collapse at any moment, making it fundamentally unstable and untrustworthy. What we can say clinically is this: the moments of humanity we see scattered across 27 seasons of South Park tell us that Eric Cartman is not beyond help. He is not a lost cause. He has the cognitive capacity for change, the emotional capacity for empathy, and has demonstrated, however briefly, the ability to function within pro-social boundaries. These are all positive prognostic indicators. The fact that every opportunity for change has been sabotaged by his environment does not mean that change is impossible. It means that change would require a different environment. Whether Cartman will ever find that environment is another question entirely. And it brings us to what has been happening to Cartman over the course of the series, the slow and terrible escalation of everything we have been discussing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown, because if you watch South Park from the beginning and pay close attention to Cartman's behavior over time, a disturbing pattern emerges. He is getting worse, not randomly, not chaotically, but in a steady, identifiable escalation that follows a trajectory any psychologist could have predicted. There are additional moments of humanity that deserve attention because they add further complexity to the clinical picture and challenge the simplistic interpretation that Cartman is nothing more than a developing sociopath. Consider the episode Major Boobage, in which Cartman secretly shelters cats in his attic while a town-wide ban on cat ownership is enforced. The episode deliberately parallels the story of Anne Frank, with Cartman playing the role of protector, hiding the cats from authorities who would take them away. On the surface, this appears to be pure Cartman. He is defying authority, which he enjoys. He is operating a secret scheme, which he thrives on. He is positioning himself as important and necessary, which feeds his narcissism. But a psychologist would look more carefully at the emotional dynamics of the episode and notice something that does not fit neatly into the conduct disorder profile. Cartman is genuinely gentle with the cats. He talks to them softly. He cares for their needs. He takes real risks to protect them. And when the situation becomes dangerous, when discovery is imminent, his primary concern appears to be the safety of the cats, rather than his own well-being or the continuation of the scheme. This is not how a purely antisocial child behaves. A child with no capacity for empathy would not risk personal consequences to protect animals that offer no strategic benefit. Mr. Kitty, Cartman's own cat, provides the longest-running evidence of genuine emotional capacity. Across the entire series, Cartman's interactions with Mr. Kitty are consistently gentler, more patient, and more emotionally authentic than his interactions with any human character. He scolds Mr. Kitty sometimes, usually with the iconic, "No, Kitty, that's my pot pie," or similar food-related protests. But even these scoldings lack the venom and cruelty that characterize his interactions with people. He does not scheme against Mr. Kitty. He does not manipulate Mr. Kitty. He does not use Mr. Kitty as a tool for personal advancement. He simply lives with Mr. Kitty in something that resembles, more closely than anything else in his life, a genuine relationship based on mutual presence rather than mutual exploitation. This is significant because it tells us something about what Cartman is capable of when the interpersonal threat is removed. Mr. Kitty does not judge. Mr. Kitty does not criticize. Mr. Kitty does not see through his defenses or challenge his self-image. Mr. Kitty provides companionship without evaluation. And in that safe space, Cartman is capable of something that looks very much like love. Not the transactional, exploitative version of love he practices with humans, but something softer and more genuine. The capacity is there. It is just locked behind defenses that only disengage when the threat of being seen, truly seen, by another intelligence that could form an opinion of him is absent. There is also the matter of Cartman's creativity, which a psychologist would consider a positive prognostic indicator, even though Cartman typically deploys it in destructive ways. His songs, his personas, his elaborate theatrical productions, all of these demonstrate a creative drive that is genuine and impressive. In the episode Christian Rock Hard, Cartman forms a Christian rock band specifically to win a bet with Kyle about who can earn a platinum album first. His motivation is purely competitive and self-serving. But the music he produces, despite being a cynical manipulation of religious sentiment, is actually effective. The songs connect with audiences. They produce emotional responses in listeners. Cartman has, buried under the cynicism and the manipulation, a genuine artistic ability. A psychologist would see this creativity as evidence that Cartman's emotional life, while severely distorted and poorly integrated, is not impoverished. There is something inside him that wants to create, to express, to connect with others through shared experience. That something is currently hijacked by his personality disorder and channeled toward manipulation rather than genuine creative expression. But it exists, and in a different environment with proper support and guidance, that creative drive could potentially become a pathway toward healthier self-expression and interpersonal connection. The episode Imaginationland and its sequels provide another window into Cartman's inner world, and what they reveal is both fascinating and sad. In these episodes, Cartman's primary concern is winning a bet with Kyle that would force Kyle to perform a humiliating act. While the entire world faces an existential threat from the imagined villains of human storytelling, Cartman's attention is focused entirely on his petty personal conflict with Kyle. This is typical Cartman narcissism. The world is ending and he cares about winning a bet. But within the Imaginationland sequences, there are moments where Cartman engages with the fantasy world in ways that suggest something beyond narcissistic self-interest. He interacts with imaginary characters with a familiarity and engagement that implies deep emotional investment in the world of stories and imagination. He has clearly spent enormous amounts of time in imaginative worlds, not just as the protagonist of his own fantasies, but as a consumer and inhabitant of other people's creative universes. For a child who has so much difficulty engaging genuinely with real people, his engagement with fictional worlds and fictional characters is remarkably rich. This is consistent with research on children who have difficulty with real-world social connections. Such children often develop intense relationships with fictional worlds, finding in stories and imagination the emotional safety and predictability that real relationships cannot provide. Fictional characters behave consistently. Their motivations are legible. They do not suddenly change the rules. They do not abandon you. They do not see through your defenses. For a child like Cartman, whose real-world relationships are all compromised by his pathology, fictional worlds may represent the closest thing to genuine emotional engagement that he can safely experience. Cartman's relationship with ideological systems deserves psychological analysis as well, because it reveals another dimension of how he interacts with the world. Throughout the series, Cartman repeatedly latches onto ideological frameworks, political movements, religious causes, and group identities with an intensity that goes beyond mere opportunism. He does not just use ideologies as tools. He inhabits them, at least temporarily, with what appears to be genuine conviction. In the episode Ginger Kids, Cartman delivers a presentation arguing that ginger-haired people are subhuman and should be separated from society. This is clearly bigotry in service of his prejudice. But when the other children teach him a lesson by dyeing his hair red while he sleeps, making him believe he has become ginger, Cartman immediately and completely reverses his position. He becomes an equally passionate advocate for ginger rights, organizing rallies and delivering speeches with the same intensity he previously directed at ginger persecution. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as identity diffusion combined with ideological thinking. Cartman does not have a stable, coherent sense of self. His identity shifts based on circumstances, needs, and whatever framework currently serves his psychological needs. Ideologies provide temporary structure for a self that lacks its own internal structure. When Cartman adopts an ideology, he is not just using it instrumentally. He is borrowing the identity it provides because he does not have a solid identity of his own. This is why his ideological commitments are simultaneously intense and unstable. Each new ideology feels real because it temporarily fills the identity void. But it is easily abandoned when circumstances change because the commitment was never rooted in genuine values. It was rooted in the need to be something, anything, other than the empty, undefined child that exists underneath all the borrowed identities. This connects back to the father absence in a fundamental way. Fathers play a crucial role in identity formation. A father helps a child answer the question of who am I by providing a model, a reference point, a template against which the developing self can be compared and differentiated. Without that reference point, the child is left to construct identity from whatever materials are available. And for Cartman, the available materials are ideologies, personas, fantasies, and schemes, all of which provide temporary structure, but none of which provide the stable, continuous sense of self that a father's presence would have helped develop. In the earliest seasons, Cartman is primarily a bully and a loudmouth. He is selfish, bigoted, and obnoxious, but his actual harmful behavior is relatively limited in scope. He insults people. He whines until he gets his way. He cheats. He throws tantrums. He is, in clinical terms, a child with significant behavioral problems, but not yet a child whose behavior would warrant the most severe diagnostic categories. Then comes Scott Tenorman Must Die in Season 5, and the trajectory shifts dramatically. Something crystallizes in that episode. Before Scott Tenorman, Cartman's cruelty was impulsive and reactive. He lashed out when provoked or when he wanted something. After Scott Tenorman, his cruelty becomes proactive, strategic, and sadistic. He does not just hurt people when they get in his way. He begins designing scenarios specifically intended to cause maximum psychological devastation, and he derives pleasure from the devastation itself. This shift is consistent with what researchers observe in children with untreated conduct disorder. Without intervention, the behavior does not stay static. It escalates. The child learns from experience, becomes more sophisticated in their methods, and discovers that greater extremes produce greater results. Each successful act of manipulation or cruelty lowers the threshold for the next one. The line that separates acceptable from unacceptable behavior moves further and further in the direction of harm, because the line is maintained by consequences, and there are no consequences. Look at the progression. Season 1 through 4, Cartman is primarily a verbal bully who occasionally acts out physically. Season 5, he commits what amounts to double homicide and cannibal desecration. Seasons 6 through 8, he leads hate campaigns, starts a church for profit, manipulates people into believing in false threats. Seasons 9 through 12, he causes multiple deaths, manipulates national events, and demonstrates increasingly sophisticated and cold-blooded strategic thinking. Seasons 13 onward, his behavior oscillates between extreme cruelty and occasional moments of humanity. But the baseline of what he is willing to do has shifted permanently upward. This is a reinforcement spiral. Every time Cartman engages in extreme behavior and suffers no lasting consequences, the behavior is reinforced. Success teaches him that the behavior works. Absence of consequences teaches him that the behavior is permitted. The combination of positive reinforcement, he gets what he wants, and negative reinforcement, he avoids punishment, creates a powerful conditioning cycle that drives the behavior toward increasing extremity. Think about what Cartman has learned from his accumulated experience. He has learned that elaborate schemes succeed more often than simple approaches. He has learned that the suffering of others can be a source of personal pleasure. He has learned that people will eventually forgive or forget almost anything, no matter how extreme. He has learned that his mother will never impose meaningful consequences. He has learned that his school will never take effective action. He has learned that his community will eventually return to normal no matter what he does. Each of these lessons pushes him further along the escalation trajectory, and critically, the lessons build on each other. The confidence he gained from successfully executing the Scott Tenorman scheme emboldened him to attempt more complex and more harmful schemes in subsequent episodes. The absence of consequences for those schemes confirmed that the world would accommodate his behavior. The confirmation that the world would accommodate him gave him permission to push even further. This is why psychologists and criminologists emphasize early intervention so strongly. Conduct disorder does not improve with time. It does not resolve itself. A child with untreated conduct disorder at age 8 does not typically become a well-adjusted teenager at 14. They become a more sophisticated, more dangerous, more deeply entrenched version of the child they were at 8. The patterns calcify. The skills sharpen. The willingness to cause harm grows as the internal barriers to harm continue to erode from disuse. Research on the developmental trajectory of conduct disorder shows that without intervention, approximately 40% of children diagnosed with conduct disorder go on to meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. The callous unemotional traits specifier, which Cartman clearly meets, increases this percentage significantly. Children with conduct disorder who also show callous unemotional traits have the poorest prognosis of any group, because the very trait that makes them dangerous, the absence of empathy and remorse, is also the trait that makes them most resistant to change. You cannot guilt someone into changing if they do not experience guilt. You cannot appeal to their empathy if they do not have functional empathy. The normal therapeutic levers that work with other behavioral disorders are absent or severely impaired in this population. The community's role in Cartman's escalation cannot be overstated. In a functional community, a child showing the early warning signs that Cartman displayed would be identified and referred for assessment long before the behavior reached extreme levels. Teachers would flag the aggression. School counselors would assess the family situation. Social services would investigate the home environment. Mental health professionals would begin treatment. The system would activate to protect both the child and the people around them. In South Park, none of this happened. Not because the community lacks these institutions, but because every institution failed to function. The teachers are themselves dysfunctional. The counselor is ineffective. Social services appear not to exist. The police are incompetent. The religious community is compromised. The result is a child falling through every net that should have caught him, accelerating as he falls, becoming more dangerous and more damaged with every year that passes without meaningful intervention. This is not unique to fiction. In communities around the world, children with conduct disorder and callous unemotional traits fall through the same gaps. Schools lack the resources for proper assessment. Mental health services are underfunded or inaccessible. Parents lack the education or support to recognize what they are dealing with. And by the time the behavior becomes severe enough that the system can no longer ignore it, often when the child has committed a crime serious enough to involve the justice system, the window for effective early intervention has closed. Cartman is a cartoon character, but the trajectory he follows is not fictional. It is the trajectory of thousands of real children in real communities where the systems meant to catch them failed in exactly the ways South Park depicts. The comedy makes it palatable. The exaggeration makes it memorable. but the underlying pattern is devastatingly accurate. Let us pause on this escalation pattern and examine it more closely because the specific trajectory matters. It is not just that Cartman gets worse. It is how he gets worse and what the progression reveals about the psychology we have been analyzing. In the very earliest episodes of South Park, seasons 1 and 2, Cartman's behavior is primarily verbal and reactive. He calls people names. He whines. He demands things from his mother. He cheats at games. He throws tantrums when he does not get his way. These behaviors are obnoxious and problematic, but they are also recognizable as the behavior of a spoiled child whose boundaries have not been set. A clinician evaluating season 1, Cartman would note behavioral problems and recommend parent training for Liane. The prognosis at this stage would be cautiously optimistic. The problems are significant but not yet entrenched. With early intervention, this child could be redirected. Seasons 3 and 4 represent a transitional period. Cartman's behavior begins to shift from primarily reactive to increasingly proactive. He starts initiating schemes rather than just responding to situations. In Shinpakumon, he becomes a willing participant in a brainwashing plot. Not because he has been tricked, but because the plot aligns with his desire for conformity and dominance. In the wacky molestation adventure, he manipulates the legal system to have his parents arrested so he can attend a concert unsupervised. These schemes demonstrate growing sophistication and a willingness to cause significant collateral damage in pursuit of relatively trivial goals. The threshold for what Cartman considers an acceptable cost-benefit ratio is already shifting in a dangerous direction. Then comes season 5 and Scott Tenorman Must Die, which represents not just an escalation, but a fundamental transformation. Something crystallizes in Cartman during this episode. The child who was a bully becomes something else. The scheme's success teaches him that he is capable of operating at a level of sophistication and cruelty that surpasses anything he had previously imagined. And because the scheme succeeds completely, because he faces no meaningful consequences, the lesson is permanently encoded. He can do this. He can operate at this level, and the world will let him. What follows in subsequent seasons is the behavior of a person who has discovered their own capabilities and is exploring their limits. Seasons 6 through 8. Cartman starts a Christian rock band as a scam, joins NAMBLA, attempts to have his hand grafted with Jennifer Lopez's body, impersonates a mentally disabled child to compete in the Special Olympics, and manipulates Butters into believing the world has ended. Each scheme is more elaborate and more psychologically cruel than the last, but crucially, none of them produce lasting consequences for Cartman. He is never permanently punished. He is never removed from his environment. He is never subjected to the kind of sustained intervention that might interrupt the pattern. The absence of consequences is doing something very specific to Cartman's developing psychology. It is teaching him that the world has no real limits. Think about what that means from a developmental perspective. One of the fundamental tasks of childhood is learning that actions have consequences, that the world pushes back, that other people's feelings and rights create boundaries that cannot be crossed without cost. Every time a parent says no and means it, every time a teacher enforces a rule, every time a friend withdraws because of hurtful behavior, the child is learning about limits. These limits are not just restrictions. They are information. They tell the child where the edges of acceptable behavior are. They provide the structure within which a healthy personality can develop. Cartman has received almost none of this information. His mother says no and immediately reverses herself. His teachers impose consequences that evaporate within the episode. His friends get angry and then reset to their default positions by the next story. The world, as Cartman experiences it, is a place without durable limits. And a child who grows up without durable limits does not become free. They become lost. They escalate their behavior not because they enjoy causing harm, although in Cartman's case he often does, but because they are searching for the wall. They are testing unconsciously to find out where the limits actually are. Each escalation is partly a question. Is this the line? Is this where someone stops me? And each time the answer is no, the next escalation becomes inevitable. There is research supporting this interpretation. Studies on children in environments with inconsistent or absent discipline show that these children often engage in what psychologists call limit testing escalation. They push boundaries progressively further, not purely out of defiance, but out of a developmental need to find the edges of their world. When they find a firm, consistent limit, many children actually show relief, even if they also show anger in the moment. The limit provides the security of knowing where you stand. But when no limit is found, when every push produces a give rather than a wall, the child keeps pushing. And the behavior that results from unlimited pushing can become extreme enough to look pathological, even in children who might have been perfectly normal if someone had simply said no and held the line. Cartman's relationship with the legal and criminal justice system across the series follows this same pattern of consequenceless escalation. He has been arrested, detained, and confronted by law enforcement numerous times. In virtually every instance, the consequences are temporary and ultimately inconsequential. He goes to juvenile detention and returns unchanged. He is confronted by police officers who are too incompetent to follow through. He faces legal proceedings that are resolved in his favor or simply forgotten by the next episode. The justice system, which in a real community would eventually catch and hold a child this dangerous, functions in South Park as yet another failed safety net, another institution that makes noise about accountability without ever actually delivering it. Compare this to what the research tells us about the importance of consistent legal consequences for juvenile offenders with conduct disorder. The data is clear that for this population, inconsistent or absent consequences are worse than no involvement with the system at all. When a child with conduct disorder enters the justice system and then experiences no meaningful consequence, the lesson learned is not be careful. The lesson learned is even the system designed to punish me cannot actually do it. This is the lesson Cartman has learned repeatedly across the entire series. And each learning episode moves him further along the trajectory toward adult antisocial personality disorder. The seasonal structure of South Park itself contributes to the escalation dynamic in a way that mirrors real-world patterns. In reality, conduct disordered children often appear to improve temporarily after crises. They calm down after an arrest. They behave better after a parent threatens consequences. They show improvement at the beginning of a new school year or after moving to a new environment. These improvements are real but surface level. They represent temporary suppression of behavior, not genuine change in the underlying patterns. And when the suppressive influence fades, which it always does because the underlying drivers have not been addressed, the behavior returns, usually at a level equal to or worse than before the temporary improvement. South Park's episodic reset structure, where consequences from one episode rarely persist into the next, creates exactly this dynamic. Cartman may face a consequence within an episode, but by the next episode, the consequence has evaporated. He starts fresh, and the fresh start is not a real fresh start. It is a reset to baseline with the lessons from the previous escalation intact. He remembers what he learned about his capabilities. He remembers what worked. He remembers that consequences do not stick. Each reset is a launching pad for the next escalation, not a clean slate. By the later seasons of the show, the cumulative result of this pattern is a Cartman who is fundamentally different from the Cartman of season 1. The same basic traits are present, the narcissism, the selfishness, the aggression, the manipulation. But the scale has changed, the sophistication has increased, the willingness to cause harm has expanded, and the capacity for empathy, which was already limited, has been further eroded by years of unchecked escalation. The Cartman of season 20 is not a more mature version of the Cartman of season 1. He is a more dangerous version. He has had 20 years of practice at exploitation and cruelty, 20 years of positive reinforcement for antisocial behavior, 20 years of learning that the world will accommodate whatever he does. He is the adult that the child was always heading toward becoming, just in a 9-year-old's body. And the adults around him, who could have intervened at any point along the way, watched it happen and did nothing effective to stop it. So we arrive at the final question, the one that underlies everything we have discussed for the last 2 hours. Can Eric Cartman be helped? If you gathered the best child psychologists, the best family therapists, the most experienced clinicians in the country, gave them unlimited resources and unlimited time, and told them to fix Eric Cartman, what would happen? Could they do it? And the honest answer, the one a responsible clinician would give, is maybe, not definitely, not probably, maybe, The maybe comes from a careful weighing of prognostic factors, both positive and negative. On the positive side, there are several factors that suggest Cartman is not beyond redemption. First, he has demonstrated, however briefly, the capacity for prosocial behavior. The test transformation proves that given the right conditions, Cartman can function within boundaries. Second, he has intermittent empathic responses. The moments of genuine seeming distress over Kenny's deaths, the internal conflict during the 1% stuffed animal crisis, the ambiguous but possible genuine reform in the post-COVID timeline, all suggest that the empathic capacity exists but is severely suppressed by his defensive structure. Third, he is young. Neuroplasticity is still high in childhood. The brain is still developing. Patterns that seem fixed can still be altered if intervention occurs before the personality structure fully consolidates in late adolescence. Fourth, his intelligence, which currently drives his most destructive behavior, could potentially be redirected toward constructive ends if the underlying emotional and relational issues were addressed. On the negative side, the factors are formidable. The callous unemotional traits specifier is the single strongest negative prognostic indicator. Children who meet this specifier are the most treatment-resistant population in child psychology. Traditional therapeutic approaches, which rely on building rapport, fostering empathy, and developing insight, often fail because the foundational capacities those approaches depend on are impaired. Second, the duration and severity of Cartman's behavioral problems are extreme. The longer maladaptive patterns persist, the more resistant they become to change. Cartman has been operating this way for his entire life. These are not recently developed coping strategies. They are the deep structure of his personality. Third, his environment actively maintains his dysfunction. You can provide the best therapy in the world, but if the patient returns every day to the same environment that produced the problem, progress will be continuously undermined. Leanne cannot maintain boundaries. The school cannot provide consistent structure. The community cannot sustain accountability. Any therapeutic gains would be fighting against the constant pull of an environment designed to undo them. Fourth, Cartman himself has no motivation to change. He does not experience his behavior as problematic. His narcissistic structure prevents him from recognizing that he needs help. He is satisfied with himself. He enjoys his life as he understands it. He does not feel the distress that typically drives people to seek and engage with treatment. Without internal motivation, therapy becomes exponentially more difficult. If treatment were attempted, the approach that the research literature suggests would be most appropriate for a case like Cartman's is called multisystemic therapy, or MST. MST was developed specifically for adolescents with serious behavioral problems, including conduct disorder with callous, unemotional traits. Unlike traditional therapy, which treats the individual in isolation, MST treats the individual within their environmental context. It simultaneously addresses the child's behavior, the family dynamics, the school environment, and the community factors that maintain the problem. For Cartman, MST would involve several simultaneous interventions. Leanne would receive intensive individual therapy to address her substance abuse, her emotional dependence on Cartman, and her inability to set and maintain boundaries. The family unit would receive therapy together to restructure the enmeshed dynamic and establish a healthy parent-child hierarchy. Cartman would receive individual therapy focused on developing emotional awareness, empathy skills, and prosocial behavior patterns. His school would be incorporated into the treatment plan, with teachers trained to provide consistent behavioral expectations and consequences. And the broader community, such as it is, would be engaged to provide a reinforcement environment that supports therapeutic goals rather than undermining them. Would it work? The research on MST with callous, unemotional youth shows modest but real improvements in behavior, family functioning, and recidivism rates. The outcomes are not dramatic. They are not transformative in the way that television depicts therapy. They represent slow, incremental, often frustrating progress punctuated by setbacks and relapses. But they represent progress nonetheless, and for a population as treatment-resistant as callous, unemotional, conduct-disordered youth, any progress is significant. The core problem, the problem that overrides all therapeutic considerations, is that the system that broke Cartman is the same system that would need to support his treatment. Leanne would need to fundamentally change her relationship with her son, which would mean confronting her own loneliness, her substance issues, and her dependence on Cartman for emotional sustenance. The school would need to provide consistent, structured behavioral expectations, which would require competent administrators and functional staff. The community would need to hold Cartman accountable, which would require the kind of sustained attention that South Park's community has never demonstrated. All of this is possible in theory. None of it is likely in practice, at least not within the world of the show. And that, ultimately, is the psychological tragedy of Eric Cartman. Not that he is broken, not that he is dangerous, not that he causes enormous harm to everyone around him. The tragedy is that he did not have to be this way. He could have been different. The Teast episode proves he could have been different. But the world that made him what he is does not contain the resources to unmake it. There is a concept in clinical psychology called iatrogenic harm, which refers to damage caused by the treatment itself. The opposite of iatrogenic harm is what the Cartman case represents. It is harm caused by the absence of treatment. Every day that passes without intervention is a day that Cartman's patterns entrench further, his defenses rigidify more, his behavior escalates, and the window for meaningful change narrows. He is not standing still. He is moving in the wrong direction, and he is moving there because no one has ever consistently and effectively tried to redirect him. We began this analysis with the argument that Eric Cartman is not a monster who appeared out of nowhere. He is the predictable product of environmental failure, and that argument has been supported by everything we have examined. His conduct disorder traces to the permissive parenting and adverse childhood experiences his environment provided. His narcissism traces to the emotional neglect disguised as indulgence that characterized his upbringing. His manipulation skills trace to the social learning environment that rewarded exploitation and ignored harm. His attachment disruption traces to the inconsistent, enmeshed relationship with his mother and the total absence of his father. His moral disengagement traces to the absence of consistent moral accountability in his community. His escalation traces to the absence of consequences across his entire life. Every piece of Cartman's psychology connects to every other piece, and all of it connects to the environment that shaped him. He was not born this way. The research is clear that while genetic factors contribute to vulnerability, it is environmental factors that determine whether that vulnerability develops into a full clinical syndrome. Children with genetic predispositions toward antisocial behavior who are raised in structured, consistent, loving environments rarely develop conduct disorder. It is the combination of vulnerability and environmental failure that produces the outcome we see in Cartman. This is why his case matters beyond entertainment. Because Eric Cartman is not just a cartoon character, he is a composite portrait of a real population of children who exist in communities around the world. Children with conduct disorder and callous, unemotional traits who are being raised in permissive or neglectful households without adequate support systems. Children whose schools do not have the resources to identify them. Children whose communities do not have the infrastructure to help them. Children who are falling through the same gaps that Cartman fell through, on the same trajectory that Cartman followed, toward the same outcomes that Cartman is heading toward. The only difference is that in real life, when these children reach adulthood and the conduct disorder matures into antisocial personality disorder, there are no laugh tracks. There are no commercial breaks. There are no season finales where everything resets. There are only real consequences for the individuals and for the people around them that persist and compound and devastate in ways that comedy can sketch but never fully capture. A psychologist looking at Eric Cartman would feel the same thing that good clinicians feel when they encounter any child this damaged and this underserved, a mixture of professional assessment and human sadness. Sadness not for what Cartman is, because what he is includes genuine danger and real harm to real people. But sadness for what he could have been, and sadness for the failures, small and large, individual and systemic, that turned a child who might have been okay into someone who almost certainly will not be. There is one final psychological question that has been implicit throughout this entire analysis, and it deserves to be addressed directly before we close. It is the question that sits at the heart of every case involving antisocial behavior in children, and it is one that psychology has been wrestling with for over a century. Was Eric Cartman born this way, or was he made this way? Nature or nurture? Genetics or environment? The honest answer, the one that reflects the current state of the science, is that the question itself is misleading. It is not nature versus nurture. It is nature through nurture. Genes and environment do not operate independently. They interact continuously and dynamically from the moment of conception through every developmental stage. A child's genetic makeup influences how they respond to their environment, and the environment influences which genetic predispositions are expressed and which remain dormant. Separating the two is like trying to determine whether the length or the width of a rectangle is more responsible for its area. The question does not have a meaningful answer because both dimensions are essential and neither operates alone. What we can say is that Cartman almost certainly has some genetic vulnerability to antisocial and narcissistic personality traits. Behavioral genetics research, including twin studies and adoption studies, has consistently shown that antisocial behavior has a heritable component. Estimates vary, but roughly 40 to 60% of the variance in antisocial behavior can be attributed to genetic factors. The callous, unemotional traits that Cartman displays have been shown to be particularly heritable, more so than other aspects of conduct disorder. This means that even in a perfectly optimal environment, Cartman might still have been a challenging child. His temperament was likely difficult from birth. He was probably more irritable, more demanding, more resistant to soothing, and more prone to frustration than an average infant. These temperamental characteristics would have made him harder to parent, which matters because they were combined with a parent who was already severely limited in her capacity to provide adequate care. But genetics is not destiny. The same temperamental vulnerabilities that, in Cartman's environment, developed into severe conduct disorder with callous, unemotional traits, might have produced very different outcomes in a different environment. Research on gene-environment interactions and antisocial behavior, particularly the landmark studies by Avshalom Caspi and colleagues, has shown that genetic vulnerability to antisocial behavior is most likely to result in actual antisocial outcomes when combined with adverse environmental conditions. Children with the same genetic vulnerabilities who are raised in structured, supportive environments show dramatically lower rates of conduct problems than their counterparts in adverse environments. The gene loads the gun. The environment pulls the trigger. In Cartman's case, every environmental trigger was pulled simultaneously. The permissive parenting activated the genetic predisposition toward behavioral disinhibition. The absent father activated the predisposition toward authority problems and identity instability. The adverse childhood experiences activated the predisposition toward emotional dysregulation. The absence of consequences activated the predisposition toward escalating antisocial behavior. And the enmeshed, boundary-free family system activated the predisposition toward narcissistic personality organization. Each environmental factor interacted with the genetic substrate to produce outcome that neither genetics nor environment alone would have produced. Cartman is not a product of bad genes. He is not a product of a bad environment. He is a product of bad genes in a bad environment, which is a fundamentally different thing than either factor in isolation. This has implications for how we think about responsibility. If Cartman's behavior is partly genetic, can he be held responsible for it? If his environment shaped him into what he is he to blame for what his environment created? These are not just philosophical questions. They are practical questions that courts, schools, therapists, and communities grapple with every day when dealing with real children whose profiles resemble Cartman's. The psychological answer is that the origins of behavior do not determine the assessment of that behavior. Understanding why someone behaves the way they do is essential for developing effective interventions. But it does not change the fact that the behavior causes harm and that the harm matters. Cartman's genetic vulnerabilities and environmental failures explain his conduct disorder. They do not excuse it. His mother's neglect explains his narcissism. It does not make the narcissism acceptable. His absent father explains his identity disruption. It does not give him permission to destroy others in compensation for his own wounds. This distinction between explanation and excuse is one of the most important concepts in clinical psychology, and it is one that is frequently misunderstood by the general public. When a psychologist explains the origins of criminal or antisocial behavior, people sometimes interpret this as a defense of the behavior, as though understanding why someone committed harm is the same as arguing that the harm was acceptable. It is not. Explanation is a tool for intervention, not a justification for inaction. Understanding that Cartman's conduct disorder developed because of permissive parenting, father absence, and adverse childhood experiences does not mean his behavior should be tolerated. It means his treatment should address those specific factors. It means interventions should target the family system, not just the individual. It means the community needs to provide the consistent accountability that the family failed to provide. Explanation serves change. Excuse prevents it. And this is ultimately why a psychologist would find Eric Cartman worth studying despite the fact that he is a cartoon character. Not because his specific case is realistic in its extremes, although many of its elements are drawn directly from real clinical patterns, but because he represents, in concentrated and vivid form, the same dynamics that operate in real children across real communities every day. The permissive parent who loves their child but cannot discipline them. The absent father whose absence distorts every aspect of the child's development. The school that identifies problems but lacks the resources or competence to address them. The community that absorbs crisis after crisis without ever addressing the underlying causes. The child who escalates and escalates and escalates, waiting for someone to set the limit that no one ever sets. These are not fictional patterns. They are documented in every child psychology textbook, observed in every school system, and treated in every child mental health clinic in the country. The difference between Cartman and the real children who follow his trajectory is that Cartman's story is told for laughs and resets every episode. The real children's stories are told in court documents, incident reports, and clinical case files, and they do not reset. They accumulate. They compound. They end, in the worst cases, in violence, incarceration, and wasted potential that can never be recovered. If there's a single takeaway from this entire analysis, from the diagnostic evaluation to the family dynamics to the defense mechanisms to the prognosis, it is this. Eric Cartman was preventable, not the genetic vulnerabilities. Those are a roll of the dice that no one controls. But the outcome, the full-blown conduct disorder with callous unemotional traits, the narcissistic personality organization, the elaborate manipulation system, the escalating trajectory toward adult antisocial personality disorder, all of that was preventable. At every stage of Cartman's development, there were points where the right intervention, delivered consistently and maintained over time, could have altered the trajectory. A competent parent, a present father, an effective school counselor, a responsive community, a therapist who understood what they were looking at. Any one of these, provided early enough and sustained long enough, might have been sufficient to redirect a genetically vulnerable child toward a functional outcome instead of a pathological one. But none of them appeared, and in their absence, the trajectory continued, propelled by its own momentum, reinforced by its own success, unchecked by any external force strong enough to alter its course. The tragedy of Eric Cartman is the tragedy of a preventable outcome that no one prevented. Not because prevention was impossible, but because every person and every system that could have made a difference either failed to act, failed to persist, or failed to exist at all. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative and that it helped you sleep. Let me know in the comments if you would like more videos like this. I appreciate all the support. And as always, I will see you all in the next one.